Every castle you have ever pictured is wrong in one particular way. It is too quiet. In the pictures in your mind, the stone is pale and still, the halls are empty, and the only sound is wind moving across battlements under a full moon. The real ones were never like that. A castle at full strength on an ordinary evening was one of the loudest, busiest, most crowded buildings a person could stand inside. Dogs barked under long tables. Smoke hung at shoulder height in a room built for 200 people and a single fire. Somewhere below a floor of packed earth and old rushes, something had been dropped, forgotten, and trodden in months ago, and its smell had simply become part of the room, the way a sound becomes part of a house until you stop hearing it at all. This is not the castle of film and legend. This is the castle as the people who lived in it actually knew it, through the parts of themselves that history rarely asks about, not what it looked like, what it smelled like when the wind changed, what it sounded like at the exact moment the doors were barred for the night, what it felt like to press a hand against stone that never, not once in the coldest months, grew warm. Tonight you are going inside, not as a visitor with a guidebook, and not as someone hunting for a battle or a betrayal, just as a body moving slowly through rooms that have not existed in this exact form for 700 years, noticing the things a body notices, the smoke, the straw, the cold that lives permanently in certain corners no fire ever reaches. Let the outside world fall away. There is nowhere else to be tonight but here, inside the stone. Think for a moment of every detail a costume drama gets wrong without ever meaning to. The hall lit brightly enough for a camera when the real one would have left most faces in shadow past the second row of tables. The floor swept bare stone when the real one lay thick with rushes and the particular smell that comes from months of feet passing over them. The silence between lines of dialogue when the real hall was never once in its entire working life actually silent for more than a few minutes at a stretch. There is a reason this particular corner of history stays hidden even from people who love the Middle Ages. Historians can tell you who held which castle in which year, who besieged whom, who married whom to settle whose war. What almost nobody writes down in any century is what a place smelled like. Smell does not survive on parchment. It leaves no ruin for an archaeologist to measure. And so the sensory truth of castle life, the smoke and the tallow and the damp stone and the animal warmth has quietly slipped out of the record, even though it was, for the people who actually lived it, the largest part of every single day. Tonight that missing layer gets put back. Picture a stone kept somewhere in the borderlands, in a century before glass windows were common and before anyone had thought to build a chimney into every room. The lord who holds this castle is not important to our purposes tonight, nor is his name, nor his enemies. What matters is the building itself and everyone who moves through it from before dawn until long after dark. The cook who has not seen daylight since sunrise. The dog that sleeps closest to the hearth because it has learned through trial exactly where the warmth pools. The watchman on the wall walk, breath fogging, listening for a sound that never quite comes. If you have ever listened to an audiobook before falling asleep, you may already know that this whole library of slow, sense-filled histories is also available that way, read aloud in full on Spotify, with the link waiting in the description or the pinned comment whenever you want it. If you enjoy listening to sleepy stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. Now let the outside world close its door behind you. Somewhere above, a bell has just marked the hour. Somewhere below, a fire is being fed one more log before it is allowed to settle for the night. Follow the smoke. That is where we begin. None of what follows tonight requires you to remember any of it by morning. There will be no quiz, no test of names or dates. The only task tonight asks of you is the oldest one there is, simply to lie still, to listen, and to let one detail settle quietly into the next until the weight of the day finally lifts. The Great Hall does not have a fireplace in the way you might expect. For much of the medieval period, the fire sits in the centre of the room, on a raised hearth of stone or packed clay, with no chimney breast to gather its smoke and carry it politely away. Above it, cut into the roof timbers, there is a louvre, a wooden lantern-shaped opening designed to let smoke escape into the sky. It is a good idea in theory. In practice, on a still evening, or when the wind turns the wrong way against the walls, more of that smoke settles back down into the hall than ever finds its way out. You notice it first as a haze at head height, thin enough to see through, but thick enough to soften every edge in the room. The tapestries along the far wall are not the bright blues and reds they were when they were hung. Years of this same smoke have dulled them toward a uniform brown, the colour of a room that has been quietly, patiently smoked, like a piece of meat for longer than anyone currently living can remember. Chimneys built into the wall itself, the kind that carry smoke up through a proper flue, are still something of a luxury in these centuries. They exist in the private chambers of the wealthiest households, but the great hall itself, the room built to hold the whole community at once, usually keeps its old open hearth long after smaller rooms have been improved. There is a kind of stubbornness to it. The open hearth is what a hall has always had, and a hall that changes too much stops feeling like the one your grandfather knew. The smoke has its uses, and the people who live inside it know this even if they never say it aloud. Wood smoke settling into the roof timbers year after year does something useful to the wood. It dries it, hardens it, and makes it far less inviting to the beetles and worms that would otherwise slowly eat a roof apart from the inside. A blackened rafter is often a rafter that will still be sound in 80 years, long after a clean pale one would have failed. What looks to modern eyes like neglect is closer to a very old, very effective form of preservation, arrived at not through any written theory but through centuries of watching which roofs lasted and which did not. Still, there is a cost, and the cost is paid by every set of lungs in the room. A cough that never quite clears is simply part of what a body sounds like in winter, when the hall is shut against the cold and the fire is fed constantly to keep 200 people from freezing. Eyes sting faintly by the middle of the evening. Nobody remarks on it. It would be like remarking on the fact that water is wet. The fuel itself changes what the smoke smells like, and the difference is not subtle once you learn to notice it. Oak and ash burn with a clean, almost sweet smoke, the kind that clings pleasantly to wool and hair. Green wood, cut too recently and not properly seasoned, burns wet and bitter, filling the hall with a smell closer to something scorched than something warmed. In regions where peat is more available than good timber, the smoke carries an entirely different character. Earthy and faintly sweet, the smell of compressed centuries of bog being slowly returned to the air. Whoever tends the fire through the day, usually one of the youngest servants or a boy not yet old enough for heavier work, learns this vocabulary of smoke without ever being taught it as such. He learns which logs will smoke and which will burn clean by looking at the bark, by the weight of the wood in his hand, by whether it feels damp against his palm, even when it looks dry. A fire that smokes too much earns him a sharp word from the steward. A fire that burns down too fast earns him a colder hall and a harder night. By late afternoon, when the hall begins to fill for the evening meal, the smoke has already claimed its usual place near the roof, a low grey ceiling suspended above the heads of everyone seated below. Sound behaves strangely underneath it. Voices seem to travel differently through smoke-thick air, slightly muffled, slightly softened, as though the room itself is trying to hush its occupants without quite managing it. The whitewash on the stone walls, where it survives at all, is reapplied every so often specifically to fight this same smoke. Lime wash, brushed on in a thin milky coat, brightens the walls for a season or two before the soot begins, slowly, to win again. It is a battle nobody expects to finish winning. The most anyone hopes for is to stay a season or two ahead of the grey. Even the smell of a person's clothing carries this history. Wool holds smoke the way it holds almost everything, stubbornly and for a long time. A cloak worn through several winters in a smoke-filled hall develops a smell that never fully leaves it, even after washing, even after being aired for days on a hedge in the sun. It becomes, in its own way, a kind of record. You could probably tell, blindfolded, whether a garment had spent its life near an open hearth or in a room with a proper flue. There is a particular moment, late in the evening, when someone adds a fresh log to a fire that has burned down to embers, and the hall fills, briefly and completely, with a thicker cloud than usual. Conversation does not stop. Nobody moves away. It is simply weathered, the way rain is weathered, as something that will pass in a few minutes once the new wood catches properly and starts to burn clean. Children who grow up in halls like this develop a tolerance for smoke that a modern lung would find remarkable, and also, quietly, a set of health problems that nobody in this century has the means to fully understand or name. Chronic coughs, reddened eyes that never fully clear. These are simply accepted as part of what it costs to stay warm through a winter that would otherwise kill far more efficiently than smoke ever could. Outside the hall, if you were to stand in the bailey and look up, you would see the smoke rising from the Louvre in a thin grey column against the sky, visible from a considerable distance on a still day. To an approaching traveller, that column of smoke means something specific and welcome. It means the hall is occupied, the fire is lit, and somewhere inside, however smoky, however dim, there will be warmth to be had. It is easy, from the comfort of a warm, smoke-free room 7 centuries later, to imagine this as simply unpleasant, a hardship to be endured. But sit inside the hall itself for long enough, and something else becomes clear. The smoke is not separate from the warmth. It arrives with the warmth, is part of the same fire, the same reason 200 people can gather in one room in the coldest months and not freeze. You cannot have one without accepting the other, and after enough winters, most people stop trying to separate them at all. The fire burns lower now as the evening settles. The smoke thins with it, drifting up through the Louvre in a slower, gentler stream. Somewhere beneath that softening haze, the hall is beginning to quiet, one voice at a time, the way it does every night at roughly this hour, whether anyone below is paying attention to the pattern or not. There is also a hierarchy to who sits nearest the smoke and who sits furthest from it, though it is rarely spoken of in those terms. The high table, raised on its dais at one end of the hall, sits slightly apart from the worst of the haze, closer to whatever draft moves through the room and carries some of the smoke away before it settles. Further down the long tables where the household servants and lesser guests take their places, the air sits thicker and stiller. Status in a castle hall can sometimes be measured quite literally in how clearly a person can see the far wall. The steward who manages the household knows the fire's habits, the way a sailor knows tides. He knows that a fire fed too generously too early in the evening will smoke terribly for the first hour and then burn clean once it settles into proper embers. He knows that a fire started too late means a cold hall during the very hours the Lord expects warmth. Managing this is not glamorous work, and it earns no songs, but a poorly managed hearth can sour an entire evening for 200 people, and everyone from the lowest scullion to the Lord himself notices when it goes wrong. In summer, the fire in the great hall often shrinks to something smaller, sometimes little more than embers kept alive for cooking rather than warmth. The smoke thins correspondingly, and for a few months the hall breathes more easily. But even then, the walls carry the memory of winter smoke in their colour, in the faint grey shadow that never quite lime washes away from the highest reaches of the roof, out of reach of anyone's brush. Travellers who have visited many halls in their lives can sometimes tell, within moments of stepping inside a new one, roughly how well or poorly that particular household manages its fire. A hall that greets a visitor with stinging eyes and a fit of coughing says something about its keeper, whether fairly or not. A hall where the smoke rises cleanly and gathers only faintly near the roof suggests careful management, good dry wood, and a steward who takes the small, unglamorous tasks seriously. By the time full dark has settled outside, the fire has usually been built up one final time for the evening, banked high enough to last through the hours when most of the household will be asleep. This is the moment the smoke is thickest, briefly, before the wood settles and the flames find their steady rhythm. It rises, gathers beneath the roof, and slowly finds its way out through the Louvre into a sky that has long since gone dark. There is a strange trick the smoke plays on newcomers that long-time residents rarely think to mention. A guest arriving from a smaller house with a proper chimney will often, on the very first evening, assume something has gone wrong with the fire, that a flue must be blocked or a wind is behaving badly. It takes a night or two before they understand that nothing at all is wrong. This is simply how the hall has always breathed and always will, until some future generation decides a chimney belongs here after all. Soot itself becomes, oddly enough, a useful household substance rather than pure waste. Scraped carefully from the inside of the Louvre or the blackened stones nearest the hearth, it finds its way into ink for the household's few literate members, into certain rough medicinal pastes applied to wounds by the more experienced healers among the servants, and occasionally into the dark pigment of a simple dye. Almost nothing produced by daily life here goes entirely unused. The Louvre itself, that lantern-shaped opening cut into the roof specifically to let smoke escape, is rarely a simple hole. In better-built halls, it is fitted with a small turning cap, sometimes carved from wood, sometimes covered in a thin sheet of lead, designed to be adjusted according to the direction of the wind. A servant assigned to this task climbs, when necessary, to turn the opening away from a gust that would otherwise push smoke back down into the hall rather than drawing it out. A small piece of daily maintenance that most of the seated household never notices happening above their heads at all. Guests from regions where chimneys have already become common sometimes cannot resist a comment on their first evening in a hall like this, however politely phrased. A well-mannered host learns to receive such comments with practiced grace, since criticizing another household's hearth arrangement, however gently intended, brushes uncomfortably close to criticizing the household itself, its wealth, its habits, its long-standing ways of doing things that no visitor, however well-traveled, has any real standing to judge after a single evening's exposure to the smoke. Some households, wealthier or simply more willing to experiment, eventually install a proper chimney breast against one wall of the hall, keeping the old central hearth as well for a time out of habit before finally abandoning it entirely once the improvement proves its worth. The transition is rarely quick. A hall that has smoked in the same familiar way for generations does not change its character overnight simply because a mason has built something new into one wall, and it can take years before the household fully trusts the new arrangement enough to let the old hearth go cold for good. By the time you have spent a full day inside the hall, you stop registering the smoke as smoke at all. It becomes simply the smell of indoors, the smell of safety, the smell your own body has come, without any conscious decision, to associate with warmth and company and the end of a long day's work. Step outside into clean winter air after such a day, and it is the sharp absence of smoke, oddly enough, that feels unfamiliar for the first few breaths before your lungs remember what plain cold air is actually supposed to feel like. Step down from the dais and onto the hall floor itself, and the first thing you notice is that there is no floor to speak of, not in the sense you might expect. Beneath your feet is packed earth, sometimes covered with flat stone slabs near the hearth where the fire's heat would otherwise crack them, but for most of the hall's width, simply earth, trodden hard and smooth by generations of feet. Over this earth lies a covering of rushes or straw or sometimes sweet-smelling meadow herbs, scattered loose across the entire floor. This layer of rushes is not merely decorative, it is practical in a dozen small ways at once. It softens the hard floor underfoot, it absorbs to some degree whatever is spilled or dropped during a long evening of eating and drinking. It provides a small measure of insulation against the cold that rises endlessly from packed earth in a stone building with no cellar beneath it. And it is refreshed, in a well-run household, with some regularity, new rushes strewn on top of the old. That last detail matters more than it might first appear. Not every household refreshes its floor covering as often as it should. In many halls, new rushes are simply added on top of the old layer, rather than the old layer being fully cleared away first. Beneath the fresh green covering that a guest might see and smell on arrival, there can be a much older layer, sometimes months old, into which bones, spilled food, spit, and worse have all gradually settled and been trodden down out of sight. A well-travelled visitor, stepping into an unfamiliar hall for the first time, can often tell within a few steps how carefully that household tends its floor. A hall that smells faintly of crushed meadow sweet and fresh straw speaks well of its keeper. A hall with an undertone of something staler, something that hints at what lies beneath the visible layer, speaks rather differently, whether or not anyone present would ever say so aloud to their host's face. The choice of herbs strewn among the rushes is itself a small form of household pride. Meadowsweet, with its faint almond and honey scent when crushed, is a common favourite. Chamomile, low-growing and fragrant when trodden, is another. Lavender, where it can be afforded and grown in sufficient quantity, perfumes a room in a way that lingers pleasantly on clothing and hair. A household that can regularly strew fresh, sweet-smelling herbs across its hall floor is, in its own quiet way, announcing something about its means to anyone who steps inside and breathes. Dogs move constantly through this landscape of rushes, and their presence is neither accidental nor discouraged. Hunting hounds and smaller dogs kept simply for companionship or for catching vermin are a permanent feature of the Great Hall, curling beneath the long tables during meals, waiting for bones and scraps to be tossed down to them. Their presence is, in its own way, another form of household maintenance, since a dog beneath the table will happily dispose of dropped food before it has much chance to spoil. The sound of the rushes themselves is a constant quiet undertone beneath everything else that happens in the hall. A dry crackle and rustle follows every footstep, every dog trotting past, every servant crossing the floor with a laden tray. It is not a loud sound, but it is a continuous one, filling the small gaps between voices and footsteps and the crack of the fire with its own soft, papery texture. In winter, the rushes are laid thicker, partly for warmth and partly because fewer fresh replacements are readily available once the meadows have gone brown and the herb gardens have died back. By late winter, the floor covering in even a careful household has usually thinned and dulled considerably, waiting for the first fresh cutting of spring growth to renew it properly. Cleaning the floor beneath the rushes when it finally happens is unglamorous physical work, usually assigned to the lowest servants in the household. The old rushes are swept and gathered, the packed earth beneath is scraped where necessary, and the whole floor is, for a brief period, exposed and bare before the next layer goes down. It is one of the few moments anyone actually sees the true floor of the hall, rather than the covering laid over it. Guests of particular importance sometimes receive a subtle honor in this arrangement, without ever being told so directly. Fresh rushes, strewn specifically before their arrival, are a quiet gesture of welcome, a way of saying, without a single word, that this household considered their visit worth the effort of a clean floor. It costs little, but it is noticed in the same way a person notices a freshly swept doorstep. Beyond the Great Hall, other rooms in the castle are covered differently, or sometimes not at all. Storerooms and working spaces often keep nothing more than bare packed earth, since no one expects comfort there, only function. Private chambers belonging to the lord and his family, by contrast, are sometimes covered with woven mats, or, in the wealthiest households, small woven carpets brought from far distant trade routes, treated as valuable objects rather than everyday flooring, sometimes even hung on walls rather than walked upon at all. The kitchens have their own relationship with the floor, one dictated entirely by practicality rather than comfort. Stone or hard-packed earth, kept as clear as possible of any covering that might catch a spark from the constant cooking fires, forms the working surface beneath the cook's feet. Spills here are common and are simply mopped, swept, or in the case of grease and fat, sanded over to absorb the worst of it before someone slips. Children who grow up within these walls learn the floor of their home as intimately as they learn any other part of it, know which patches of rushes hide an uneven stone beneath, which corners the dogs favour, which spots near the hearth grow warm enough to sit on directly. It becomes, over years, a kind of map memorised entirely through the soles of bare or thinly shod feet. There is a particular moment, late at night, when the hall has mostly emptied and the last servants are banking the fire, when the rushes underfoot seem to quiet, along with everything else. Fewer feet moving across them means fewer small sounds rising from the floor, until the only rustle left comes from a single dog resettling itself closer to the dying warmth of the hearth. By morning, the floor will already carry the marks of the previous evening, small depressions where chairs were pulled back, faint darker patches where something was spilled and not quite fully absorbed by the rushes beneath. None of this is remarkable to anyone who lives here. It is simply what a floor looks like in a room where 200 people have eaten, laughed, argued, and settled in for the night, one more layer added to all the layers that came before. The floor, in the end, tells its own quiet history of the household above it, a history written not in ink, but in rushes and herbs and the particular blend of scents that rises when a foot presses down and releases, for just a moment, everything the floor has absorbed since it was last renewed. The rushes also serve a purpose that has little to do with comfort and everything to do with sound. A hall floor left entirely bare, stone against stone, would carry every footstep as a sharp, echoing report, amplified by walls built thick enough to survive a siege. Rushes soften this considerably, turning the clatter of boots and the drag of benches into something closer to a muffled shuffle. In a room where 200 people might be talking, eating, and moving about at once, this small mercy of quiet underfoot matters more than it might seem. There is a particular skill, rarely written about but well understood by the servants who perform it, in strewing rushes evenly across an uneven floor. Too thin in places and the cold packed earth shows through, uncomfortable underfoot and unwelcoming to look at. Too thick in others, and the rushes become a hazard of their own, hiding uneven stones or shifting underfoot in a way that can catch an unwary ankle, particularly for an older member of the household making their way across a dim hall by firelight alone. Some households, where the means allow it, add dried lavender or rose petals to the rushes specifically for feast days, when the hall will be fuller and warmer than usual, and the ordinary blend of herbs might not be enough to keep the air pleasant through a long evening of many courses. This is a small, temporary luxury, gone within a day or two as the delicate petals are crushed to nothing beneath hundreds of passing feet, but for the length of the feast itself, it transforms the entire character of the room. The animals that move through the hall are not limited to dogs. Cats are tolerated, even welcomed for their usefulness against the mice that would otherwise thrive in a floor covering left undisturbed for weeks at a time. A castle cat earns its place in the household as surely as any servant, moving silently along the edges of the rushes at night, doing work that nobody formally assigns but everyone quietly depends upon. Even the seasons leave their own signature in what covers the floor. Late summer brings fresh, fragrant grasses, cut while still green and only lightly dried. Deep winter, when nothing grows and travel to distant meadows becomes difficult, forces households to make do with older, staler rushes, sometimes reused and refreshed with whatever dried herbs remain in storage from autumn. A guest who visits the same hall in June and again in January would find the floor itself telling two rather different stories. One detail about these floors would likely surprise anyone stepping onto them for the first time from a later century of scrubbed boards and swept stone. Visitors who have travelled widely sometimes remark carefully and diplomatically that a floor left too long between changes can hold a truly remarkable accumulation beneath its fresh green surface. Everything from gnawed bones to spilled ale slowly compacting layer upon layer into something closer to a shallow, fragrant peat than a floor covering at all. The better households, proud of their halls, take this seriously precisely because the difference is so obvious to anyone who has smelled both kinds. Meadowsweet earns its place among the favoured strewing herbs for a reason beyond its pleasant almond and honey scent when crushed underfoot. Long before anyone understood why, households noticed that floors strewn generously with it seemed to trouble the household with somewhat less sickness than floors covered only with plain rushes. An observation with a real basis that nobody in this century could have explained, since the plant itself carries properties that later ages would eventually isolate and put to entirely different medical use altogether. The precise mixture of herbs chosen for strewing can also mark the season as clearly as any calendar. Early summer brings fresh-cut hay and the first meadow flowers, their scent bright and green. By late autumn, the household has usually shifted toward whatever dried herbs remain in storage from the harvest, their fragrance muted and earthier, mixed more heavily with plain straw simply because fresh green cuttings have become impossible to find anywhere nearby until spring returns the following year. A wealthy household visiting another for the first time sometimes brings its own small gift of dried lavender or rose petals specifically for the host's floor, a quiet, practical courtesy that says as much about the visiting family's own standards as it does about their opinion of their host's usual arrangements, offered and received with the same careful tact that governs so much of castle hospitality. Even the sound of sweeping, when the floor is finally cleared for its periodic renewal, carries its own particular rhythm, a broad, steady scrape of a birch or heather broom against packed earth, repeated in long, even strokes by a servant who has performed this exact task countless times before and could likely complete it with their eyes closed, guided entirely by the familiar resistance of broom against floor rather than by sight. If you are drifting already, that is exactly as it should be. Let yourself go. Subscribing costs nothing and simply means the next story will be waiting quietly for you the next time you need one. Sleep well and let the castle keep unfolding around you. Stone does something to sound that timber and plaster never quite manage. It does not absorb a voice so much as return it, slightly changed, a fraction of a second later, layering each word with a faint ghost of itself. In the great hall, with its high vaulted or beamed ceiling and its bare walls of cut stone, this effect is constant and impossible to ignore once you begin listening for it. A single raised voice near the hearth can be heard clearly at the far end of the hall, arriving twice in quick succession, once directly and once as an echo bouncing from the far wall. This is not entirely a flaw in the building. A castle's great hall is meant, among its other purposes, to be a room where a lord can be heard by everyone present without shouting himself hoarse. The stone that makes the room cold also makes it, in its own way, an excellent instrument for carrying a voice. Announcements, judgments, songs, all of it travels further and clearer in a stone hall than it ever could in a room built from softer, more forgiving materials. Footsteps carry in the same way, and this becomes, for anyone who lives in the castle long enough, a kind of second sense. A person walking toward the hall along the stone passage outside can be heard well before they appear in the doorway. The particular rhythm and weight of their steps sometimes recognizable to a servant who has worked alongside them for years. You learn to identify people by the sound of their approach the way you might learn to identify a knock on a door. Tapestries change this soundscape considerably wherever they hang. A bare stone wall reflects sound sharply, but a heavy woven tapestry, thick with wool and sometimes lined on the reverse side with additional cloth for warmth, absorbs a good portion of it instead. Households that can afford to hang tapestries along the length of their hall are, without necessarily intending it, also softening the room acoustically, taming some of the harshest echo and making ordinary conversation easier to follow across a crowded table. The same tapestries serve their more commonly understood purpose as well, holding back some of the cold that radiates constantly from stone walls that never fully warm, even with a fire burning nearby for hours at a stretch. A private chamber hung with tapestries on every wall feels measurably different from one left bare, both warmer to the skin and quieter to the ear, two effects that a wealthy household values for entirely separate reasons but receives from the very same cloth. Bells govern the rhythm of the entire castle day in a way that a modern visitor, accustomed to clocks and private schedules, would find almost disorienting. A chapel bell within the castle walls, or one carried on the wind from a nearby church, marks the canonical hours, the fixed points of prayer around which the whole household loosely organizes its labor, its meals, and eventually its sleep. One particular bell, rung in the evening, carries a meaning that has outlasted the practice itself by many centuries. It signals the moment when open fires throughout the household should be covered or banked down for the night, reducing the risk that an untended flame might catch and spread while everyone slept. The French phrase for this evening signal, couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire, has travelled forward through the centuries into a word still used today for a very different kind of restriction, though the fire it once referred to has long since gone out. Beyond the bells, mechanical clocks begin to appear in the wealthiest households and religious foundations by the later medieval centuries, striking the hours with a mechanism entirely separate from any bell ringer's hand. Where one of these clocks exists within a castle, its steady, deliberate ticking becomes a new and unfamiliar sound layered over everything else, a rhythm with no human breath or bell rope behind it, simply gears turning in the dark, indifferent to whoever might be listening. Sound moves differently at different heights within the castle as well. Up on the battlements, wind dominates almost everything, thinning voices and carrying them away before they can properly land. A shout from the wall, "Walk to the bailey below," often needs repeating or answering with a raised hand rather than a returned call, since the wind and the height between them can swallow words meant to travel only a short distance. Down in the undercroft, the storage level often built partly below ground, sound behaves in the opposite way, pressing close and heavy, muffled by thick stone on every side and by whatever barrels, sacks and crates are stacked within. A voice raised down there sounds strange even to the person speaking it, flattened somehow, robbed of the natural resonance it carries upstairs in the hall. The kitchen contributes its own distinct layer of sound to the castle's daily rhythm, a near-constant background of chopping, grinding, the scrape of a ladle against the side of a large pot, and the low roar of a cooking fire that never fully dies down during the hours meals are prepared. This sound rarely reaches the Great Hall directly, since kitchens are often positioned some distance away specifically to keep fire risk apart from the main living spaces, but it forms its own steady rhythm audible to anyone working nearby. At night, once most of the household has settled, the castle's soundscape narrows to something much sparser, and in its own way, more noticeable for how little there is. The occasional shift and creak of the building itself as stone and timber respond to falling temperatures. A dog's low sigh as it resettles by the last embers. Somewhere outside, faint and distant, the call of a watchman marking that all remains well along the wall. That watchman's call is one of the most reliable sounds in the entire castle, repeated at intervals through every night regardless of weather, a human voice deliberately breaking the silence at set points specifically to reassure anyone listening that the walls remain guarded and the hour is known. Children who grow up within earshot of this call often absorb it so completely into the rhythm of their nights that they notice its absence far more readily than its presence. Rain against stone produces its own particular sound, sharper and more percussive than rain against thatch or timber, striking the wall walks and roof slates with a steady patter that can be heard clearly from within, especially in rooms positioned near an exterior wall. A heavy storm can turn this patter into something closer to a continuous roar, audible even over conversation in the hall below. Wind finds every gap in a stone building eventually and produces, depending on its strength and the particular shape of the opening it passes through, anything from a low, steady moan to a thin, almost musical whistle. Arrow loops, narrow by design for defense rather than comfort, are especially prone to this, channeling passing wind into a sound distinct enough that some households claim to recognize an approaching storm by the pitch of the whistle alone well before the first raindrop falls. Even silence itself has a different texture within stone walls than it does elsewhere. A truly quiet moment in the Great Hall, on the rare occasions one occurs, carries a faint pressure to it, an awareness of the sheer mass of stone surrounding the room, holding the quiet in rather than letting it dissipate outward the way it might in a lighter, more open building. By the time the last candle in the hall has been carried away and only the embers remain to give any light at all, the castle's daytime chorus of voices, footsteps, bells, and distant labour has thinned to almost nothing. What remains is the building itself, breathing slowly through its stone, waiting, as it always does, for morning and the first bell to begin the whole pattern again. There is a reason certain words survive into languages spoken centuries after the buildings and customs that produce them have vanished entirely. The evening bell's old instruction to cover the household fire is one small perfect example, a single practical habit repeated every single night for generations across an entire continent, leaving behind nothing more than a word that still describes an entirely different kind of restriction today, its original fire long forgotten by nearly everyone who uses it. A travelling musician who performs in many different halls over the course of a working life develops a genuinely practical understanding of how each room's particular stone and shape will carry a voice or an instrument, adjusting a performance instinctively for a hall known to echo heavily versus one softened considerably by hung tapestries. This kind of knowledge, entirely unwritten, passes from one performer to another much the way a cook's judgment of a fire passes between kitchens, through observation and repetition rather than any formal instruction. Even the Great Hall's own furniture contributes to its particular acoustic character. Long wooden benches and trestle tables, set up fresh each mealtime and cleared away again each night, absorb and scatter sound rather differently than the same room would if it were left entirely bare. A hall fully set for a feast, crowded with tables, benches and bodies, actually carries voices somewhat less harshly than the same room does late at night, emptied of everything but stone, rushes and a single banked fire. A newly built hall, its stone still sharp-edged and its first tapestries not yet hung, sounds noticeably harsher and more echoing than the same room will sound a generation later, once cloth has softened its walls and years of use have worn its rushes and furnishings into a quieter, more settled acoustic character. One more way a castle's soundscape slowly matures alongside the family that lives inside it. A truly skilled steward can sometimes tell, simply from the particular quality of noise rising from the hall below, roughly how an evening is going without ever needing to step inside and look. A steady, even hum of conversation means contentment. A sudden lull followed by scattered laughter means someone has just told a story worth hearing. A sharp spike of raised voices means something worth investigating immediately before whatever small dispute has started has any chance to grow into something larger. To move between floors in most castles is to climb a spiral staircase cut into the thickness of a corner tower, narrow enough that two people can only pass each other with real difficulty, and turning tightly enough that anyone unfamiliar with it quickly learns to keep one hand trailing along the central stone newel for balance in the dim, uneven light. That spiral turns almost always in the same direction, clockwise as you climb, and the reason behind this consistent choice is more deliberate than it might first appear. A defender retreating upward, sword arm free on the outside of the turn, holds a genuine advantage over an attacker climbing after him, whose own right arm is pressed awkwardly against the central stone column and finds far less room to swing a blade freely. Very few people living in the castle ever consciously register this design, and yet everyone's body learns it anyway, favoring the outer edge of each step almost without thinking. The steps themselves are cut unevenly on purpose in some towers, varying slightly in height and depth from one to the next, a detail easy to overlook until you actually trip on one, which nearly everyone does at least once. This irregularity, like the direction of the turn, serves a defensive purpose, disrupting the rhythm of anyone racing up or down who does not already know the staircase intimately, while barely slowing those who climb it every single day. Sound climbs strangely in a space like this, tightly enclosed and constantly turning back on itself. Footsteps from several floors below can sometimes be heard clearly, oddly close, despite the distance, while a voice from the very next landing might sound curiously muffled, swallowed by the thick stone walls curving in every direction around the narrow shaft. Guessing exactly where a sound is coming from in a stairwell like this is far harder than it should be. The central newel post, worn smooth by generations of trailing hands, tells its own quiet story to anyone who pauses to notice it. Rough stone everywhere else in the tower, and yet this one column, touched daily by everyone who has ever climbed or descended past it, has been polished by nothing more than centuries of palms and fingers, smoother in places than any mason ever originally intended. Cold air pools differently within a stairwell than it does in the rooms it connects, since the shaft itself acts almost like a narrow chimney running the height of the tower, drawing draft up and down between floors regardless of which doors happen to be open or closed at any given moment. A person standing still partway up a spiral stair for more than a minute or two notices this quickly, a persistent chill quite distinct from the cold of any single room along its length. By the time you reach the top, breath slightly short from the tight climb, the particular disorientation of a spiral staircase, its constant turning, its uneven steps, its strange pockets of cold, gives way to whatever room waits at the top, and the whole climb is set aside almost immediately, filed away the way any repeated daily task eventually is, remembered by the body far more than by the conscious mind. Masons responsible for cutting these spiral stairs worked from long practical tradition rather than any written manual, passing the precise proportions and the deliberate clockwise turn down from master to apprentice across generations, a piece of defensive engineering so thoroughly absorbed into ordinary building practice that most who used it day to day likely never once considered it a defensive feature at all, simply the way a stair was built. A castle of any real size holds more than one such staircase, and household members quickly learn which one serves which purpose, a grander, slightly wider stair for the lord's own use connecting his private chambers directly toward the hall, and narrower, plainer ones tucked into corner towers for servants moving constantly between kitchen, storerooms, and upper floors on the countless small errands a working household generates throughout each day. Torches or small oil lamps set into simple wall brackets occasionally light the largest of these stairwells, though far more often a person climbing after dark relies on nothing but a single carried candle, its small flame throwing wild, shifting shadows against the curving stone walls with every step, an effect that has likely startled more than one half-asleep servant making a late-night climb over the centuries this particular tower has stood. A servant carrying a heavy tray or an awkward bundle up one of these narrow spiral stairs develops, out of sheer necessity, a particular sideways balance and rhythm entirely their own, learned through repetition rather than instruction, since there is genuinely no other way to manage the climb safely without spilling or dropping whatever is being carried along the tightly curving steps. A castle's grandest stone staircase, where one exists separate from the narrower service stairs, is built wide and gentle enough for a lord to descend with real dignity on an important occasion, a deliberate architectural choice as much about display and ceremony as about simple movement between floors, standing in obvious contrast to the tight, practical spirals used for everyday household business elsewhere in the same building. Long after everyone else has retired for the night, the last servant awake sometimes makes a final quiet climb up one of these narrow spiral stairs, checking a shuttered window, confirming a sleeping child has settled properly before descending again by touch and memory alone, the single candle they carry doing little more than confirming what their feet already know by heart after so many identical climbs before this one. Every staircase in this castle, wide or narrow, grand or plain, eventually leads somewhere, and by the deepest hours of the night, every one of them stands entirely empty, no candle carried along their curving steps, no hand trailing the worn stone newel, nothing but cold air pooling quietly in the shaft the way it always does once the household above and below has finally, fully settled into sleep. Once true darkness falls, the castle's relationship with light becomes a matter of careful, constant negotiation, since nothing burns for free, and nothing that burns is entirely without cost to the air around it. The finest candles, made from purified beeswax, burn with a clean, steady flame and a faint, pleasant sweetness that lingers in a room long after the candle itself has been snuffed. They are also, by a wide margin, the most expensive form of light available, reserved almost entirely for the church, for the Lord's own table, and for occasions important enough to justify the cost. Most of the household, most of the time, relies instead on tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat rather than wax. Tallow burns considerably less cleanly than beeswax, producing a thin trail of dark smoke and a smell that is difficult to describe as anything but faintly meaty, closer to the smell of a joint left too long over a fire than to anything you would call pleasant. A tallow candle also tends to sputter and gutter more readily, particularly in a draughty stone chamber where a breath of wind through a gap in the shutters can send the flame dancing wildly for a moment before it steadies again. For the poorest members of the household, even tallow candles represent an expense worth avoiding where possible. Rushlights fill this gap, made simply by dipping the dried pith of a rush repeatedly in melted fat until it holds enough to sustain a small flame for perhaps 20 or 30 minutes. They are cheap, they are simple to make, and they burn with a small uneven light that does little more than hold back the very nearest edge of the darkness, leaving most of a room in shadow regardless. This means that a castle at night is, by any modern standard, remarkably dim. Even the great hall, lit for an important evening with as many candles as the household can reasonably afford, leaves most of its corners in deep shadow, the light pooling close around the high table and thinning noticeably by the time it reaches the far walls. Faces across the hall are often recognized as much by voice and posture as by any clear view of their features once the candles have burned down for an hour or two. Firelight itself provides the majority of illumination in most rooms most of the time, and it behaves quite differently from candlelight, shifting and flickering with every draught, throwing shadows that move and stretch across the walls in a way that a modern electric light never does. Tapestries seem to breathe faintly in this kind of light, their woven figures appearing to shift at the edges of your vision, an effect that has likely fed more than a few ghost stories told in halls just like this one over the centuries. Private chambers, where a single small fire or a handful of candles must serve a much smaller space, feel entirely different after dark than they do by day. The same room that seemed merely modest in daylight can feel almost intimate by candlelight, its rough stone walls softened by shadow, its few pieces of furniture reduced to warm, indistinct shapes rather than sharply defined objects. Servants tasked with managing the household's supply of light develop over years a careful sense of rationing that a modern person, accustomed to simply flipping a switch, would find almost impossible to imagine. Candles are counted. Tallow is stored carefully and used sparingly. A servant who burns through the evening's allotment of light too quickly, whether through carelessness or simple bad luck with a draught that keeps extinguishing flames, can expect a sharp word from whoever oversees the household stores. The smell of a room after an evening of tallow candles lingers well past the point the candles themselves have been snuffed out. It settles into wall hangings, into wooden furniture, into clothing worn through a long evening near the light. A traveller who has spent time in many different halls can sometimes guess, from smell alone upon waking the next morning, roughly how many tallow candles burned in a room the night before, and for how long. Beeswax candles, by contrast, leave almost no trace behind them at all beyond a faint sweetness that fades within a day. This near invisibility is, in its own quiet way, part of what makes them a luxury. A room lit entirely by beeswax candles the night before smells. By morning, almost as though nothing had burned there at all, a small but telling sign of wealth that anyone who has grown up around tallow would recognize instantly upon waking in an unfamiliar bed. Moonlight and starlight on clear nights provide a different kind of illumination entirely, filtering into rooms through whatever narrow openings the walls allow. Glass windows, where they exist at all in a castle of this period, are typically reserved for the chapel or for the lord's most important private chambers. Small panes set in lead, imperfect and slightly distorting, but enough to let some natural light through without abandoning all defense against the weather. Everywhere else, wooden shutters serve the purpose instead, closed firmly against the cold and the dark once the sun has gone down, admitting no light at all until they are opened again the following morning. A room shuttered for the night and lit only by a single small candle or a low fire becomes, in effect, a tiny pocket of warm light suspended inside a much larger, much colder darkness, the rest of the castle sitting silent and unlit around it. By the time the last candle of the evening gutters out, whether by design or simply because its fuel has been spent, the darkness that follows is close to absolute in most parts of the castle. No distant streetlight, no glow from a neighbouring window, nothing but the faint red memory of embers in a banked hearth somewhere down the passage. It is a darkness that modern life has almost entirely forgotten how to experience, complete, and total, asking nothing more of you than to let your eyes finally, fully close. A single beeswax candle, weight for weight, can cost several times what a servant might earn in a full day's labour, which explains more clearly than any written household account could exactly why the great hall is lit mostly by firelight and cheaper tallow rather than by the clean, sweet glow reserved almost exclusively for the chapel altar and the Lord's own table on the most important occasions. Candle wicks themselves require regular attention through a long evening, trimmed periodically with a small pair of scissors kept close at hand for exactly this purpose. An untrimmed wick grows long and begins to smoke and gutter unevenly, throwing a dimmer, less steady light than a freshly trimmed one, and a servant responsible for the hall's candles moves quietly among them throughout the evening performing this small maintenance rarely noticed by anyone seated nearby, yet essential to keeping the room properly lit until the meal concludes. Some households, where a particular feast or holy occasion calls for it, burn scented additions alongside their usual candles, a handful of dried herbs or a few drops of a costly oil added to a dish of oil-fed lamps rather than tallow or wax candles at all. This is rare enough to be memorable, the kind of small sensory detail a guest might recall fondly for years afterward, mentioned in passing at some other household's table as evidence of just how thoroughly their hosts had gone out of their way to make an occasion feel special. A careful household also keeps a small reserve of candles set firmly aside for emergencies, a sudden illness in the night requiring light and attention, an unexpected late arrival at the gate, rather than allowing the evening's entire allotment to be used up on ordinary activity. Whoever manages these stores treats this reserve with real seriousness, since a household caught genuinely without light after dark, for whatever reason, faces a kind of helplessness that everyone here understands all too well and works hard through this small daily discipline to avoid. Firelight and candlelight together produce a particular quality of shadow that modern eyes, accustomed to steady electric brightness, rarely encounter anymore, shadows that shift constantly with every flicker, stretching and shrinking across the walls in a way that gives even a familiar, well-known room a faint sense of movement and depth it simply does not have by the flat, even light of day. There is a particular stillness to the exact moment a candle finally exhausts its fuel and gutters out entirely, a last brief flare as the very last of the wick catches, then a thin curl of smoke rising from where the flame used to be, visible for just a moment against whatever faint light remains in the room before it too disperses and is gone, leaving one small corner of the chamber a little darker than it was only a breath before. Every castle built for permanent habitation must solve in one way or another the same basic problem faced by any building full of people, and the medieval solution was both more ingenious and more immediately noticeable than modern visitors often expect. Built directly into the thickness of the outer walls, small stone closets known as garderobes serve as the castle's toilets, each one a narrow seat positioned over a vertical shaft that drops, often several full stories, down through the wall itself and out to open air below. That shaft empties, depending on the particular castle's design, either into the moat, into a ditch dug specifically for the purpose, or into a stone-lined pit at the base of the wall that is periodically cleared out by servants assigned the distinctly unenviable task, On a still day, particularly in warmer weather, the smell rising back up that same shaft is not subtle, and anyone whose private chamber happens to sit near a garderobe learns to live with a faint but persistent reminder of exactly where they are relative to the castle's plumbing. The name itself, garderobe, comes from an older use of the same small stone rooms, one that seems strange at first until the underlying logic becomes clear. The word literally means to guard clothing, and in a number of households, valuable garments were indeed hung within or near these shafts deliberately, on the understanding that the strong ammonia fumes rising from below were remarkably effective at driving away the moths and fleas that would otherwise happily make a meal of good wool or fur while it sat in storage. In the coldest months, sitting over an open shaft that connects directly to the outside air is, understandably, an unpleasant prospect regardless of any household's wealth or status. Some of the more comfortable castles address this with a padded or fur-lined seat, a small concession to comfort in an otherwise entirely function-first design, one that a lord's family might insist upon even as the household's poorer members make do with nothing but bare cold stone. Larger gatherings occasionally strain these systems in ways that become, unfortunately, a matter of historical record. Chroniclers of the period have described more than one instance where a floor built above an old cesspit, weakened over years by damp and the corrosive nature of what it held, gave way beneath the weight of an assembled crowd, a genuinely dangerous failure that stands as a grim reminder of just how much medieval sanitation depended on structures nobody could fully see or inspect from above. For most people, most days, the garderobe is simply a fact of castle life, unremarkable in the way that any daily necessity becomes unremarkable through sheer repetition. Children learn early which garderobe belongs to which part of the household, learn to time their visits to avoid a queue during the busiest hours after a large meal, learn the particular draught that always seems to find its way up through the shaft no matter the season. Washing facilities exist alongside the garderobes, but remain, by any later standard, extremely modest. A basin and ewer, water carried up from the well or a nearby cistern, serve for washing hands and face. Full bathing, in a proper wooden tub filled with water heated over the fire and carried up flight after flight of stairs by whichever servant drew the unlucky task that day, is a labour-intensive undertaking reserved for the wealthy, and even then, not attempted more than occasionally. The lord and his family, where the household's means allow it, might bathe with some regularity, sometimes weekly, sometimes less, the water shared in sequence by several family members before it is finally emptied, since heating and carrying fresh water for each individual bath would demand a truly extraordinary amount of labour. Herbs are sometimes added to the bath water, both to perfume it and in the belief, common to the period, that certain plants carried genuine health benefits when steeped this way. Most of the household, lacking the means or the leisure time for a proper bath, relies instead on more frequent washing of the hands, face, and other exposed skin, along with a change of linen undergarments as often as the household's laundry schedule allows. Linen itself, worn directly against the skin beneath heavier wool garments, absorbs a good deal of sweat and oil, and is understood, even without any formal theory of hygiene behind it, to need washing far more often than the wool worn over it. Laundry day, when it comes, is its own considerable undertaking involving large quantities of water hauled from the well or a nearby stream, a rough soap made from animal fat and lye that is hard on the hands even as it does its work, and a great deal of physical labour in the scrubbing, wringing and hanging that follows. The smell of a laundry day, all lye and damp wool and wood smoke from the fire used to heat the water, is distinct enough that it announces itself throughout the whole household hours before the washing is finished. Taken together, these small, unglamorous systems, the garderobe shaft, the basin and ewer, the occasional bath, the periodic laundry, form the quiet infrastructure beneath everything grander that happens in a castle. No song is written about them, no chronicle dwells on them at any length, and yet without them, none of the feasting or governing or praying that fills the more celebrated parts of castle life could continue for very long at all. The engineering required to route a garderobe shaft safely down through several stories of thick stone wall, angled carefully enough to avoid opening directly above a walkway or a window below, represents a surprisingly sophisticated piece of medieval design, planned as deliberately by the castle's original builders as any defensive feature, even though almost nothing has ever been written to celebrate it. Households situated directly beside a moving stream sometimes route their guardrobe drainage to empty there rather than into a static pit or ditch, relying on the current to carry waste steadily away rather than allowing it to accumulate in one place. This arrangement, where the local geography allows it, reduces considerably both the smell and the labor of periodic clearing, though it introduces its own obvious concern for anyone drawing drinking water from the very same stream further downstream, a problem medieval households understood well enough to generally avoid by careful placement of the castles well far upstream of any such outflow. Winter brings its own particular relief and its own particular danger to this whole system. Cold weather slows considerably the process of decay that produces the worst of a guardrobe shaft's smell, making the coldest months, paradoxically, some of the least offensive of the year in this one narrow respect. But a hard freeze can also seize the shaft's drainage entirely, and a household caught by surprise sometimes finds itself managing an unpleasant backup until a thaw finally sets things flowing properly again. Guests unfamiliar with a garderobe's particular design sometimes need a quiet word of guidance from a servant on their very first use, since the narrow stone seat, the draught rising from below, and the sheer unfamiliarity of the whole arrangement can genuinely disorient a traveller raised in a very different kind of household. A good host anticipates this quietly, without ever making the moment more awkward than it already tends to be for a first-time visitor. A household proud of its hospitality sometimes keeps a small dish of dried, sweet-smelling herbs near the garderobe itself, a modest gesture toward comfort that costs almost nothing yet is remembered fondly by guests who have stayed in less considerate households. One more small example of how thoroughly even the castle's least glamorous corners reflect the character of the family that keeps them. Even the household's youngest children eventually absorb, without ever being formally taught, an entire unspoken etiquette around the garderobe, when to wait quietly rather than knock, how to signal it is occupied, small rules of consideration that make communal life in close quarters like this genuinely workable rather than a constant source of friction between people who share nearly everything else about their daily lives as well. Follow the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat far enough from the Great Hall, and you will usually end up outside it entirely, crossing an open stretch of the bailey to a separate kitchen building standing apart from the main residence. This separation is deliberate, and the reasoning behind it is entirely practical rather than aesthetic. A kitchen fire burns hot, constantly, and often carelessly in the rush of preparing a meal for 200 people, and the risk of that fire spreading to the timber roof of the main hall is simply too great a danger to accept when a covered walkway between two buildings costs so little by comparison. This arrangement carries a real cost of its own, one felt most directly by anyone eating in the hall on a cold evening. Food carried across an open or lightly covered passage from the kitchen to the hall inevitably loses some of its heat along the way, particularly in winter, when the distance between a steaming pot and a waiting trencher might mean the difference between a hot meal and a merely warm one by the time it actually reaches the table. Inside the kitchen itself, the working conditions bear little resemblance to the calm, orderly image a modern kitchen might suggest. Multiple fires often burn simultaneously, each tended for a different purpose, one for roasting meat on a turning spit, another beneath a great cauldron of pottage that has likely been simmering, with fresh ingredients added as they become available, for the better part of a day or more. The heat near these fires is considerable even in the depths of winter, while the far corners of the same room can remain surprisingly cold. The sounds of the kitchen carry their own distinct character, a steady percussion of chopping knives against wooden boards, the scrape of a long-handled ladle against the sides of an iron pot, and the constant low crackle and pop of multiple fires being fed and adjusted throughout the day. Beneath all of this runs the rhythmic grinding of a hand quern or a nearby mill, turning grain into the flour that will become the household's bread, a sound so constant in some kitchens that the servants who work there claim, only half joking, to no longer notice it at all. Cleaning in a working kitchen relies on materials that would strike a modern cook as remarkably harsh. Sand, ash, and sometimes crushed shells serve as an abrasive scrub for pots and pans left crusted with burnt food, worked in vigorously by hand until the worst of the residue finally lifts free. It is hard, repetitive work, typically assigned to the youngest or newest members of the kitchen staff, and the sound of it, a steady rhythmic scraping, forms one more layer in the kitchen's constant background noise. Spices, where the household can afford them, are locked away and carefully rationed, treated with a level of security that a modern person might reserve for actual currency, which in a sense they nearly are. pepper, cinnamon, saffron, and other spices carried across enormous distances by trade command extraordinary prices, and a cook entrusted with the household spice store guards it as jealously as the steward guards the household accounts. Bread, in its many forms, anchors nearly every meal served from this kitchen, baked in a separate oven, often built as its own small structure, sometimes shared among several households in a smaller settlement rather than duplicated needlessly at every hearth. The smell of bread baking, warm and faintly sweet, even from grain far coarser than anything sold in a bakery today, is one of the few kitchen smells that carries pleasantly all the way to the great hall on a still day, arriving well ahead of the loaves themselves. Meat, when it appears on the table at all beyond the wealthiest households, is treated with a corresponding degree of care, nothing wasted if it can possibly be avoided. Bones go into the pottage for flavour once the meat itself has been carved away. Fat rendered from a joint of meat is saved carefully rather than discarded, useful later for cooking, for candles, or for the rough soap made periodically for laundry day. Fish arrives regularly as well, particularly on the many fasting days observed throughout the church calendar when meat is forbidden entirely. Salted, dried, or smoked fish, preserved for transport from distant coasts or rivers, brings its own distinct smell into the kitchen, sharp and briny, layered over everything else simmering nearby on a fasting day in a way that anyone raised in a coastal household would find entirely ordinary, and anyone raised further inland might find genuinely strange. By the time the evening meal is finally ready to be carried across to the hall, the kitchen staff have usually been at their fires since well before dawn, managing a rolling sequence of preparation that never entirely stops, since breakfast for some overlaps with preparation for the midday meal, which in turn overlaps with preparation for the evening feast. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most physically demanding forms of labour the castle depends on, and one of the least visible to anyone seated comfortably at the high table above. A skilled cook working this kitchen carries an entire library of knowledge nowhere written down, judging a fire's readiness by its colour and sound rather than any measurement, judging a pottage's doneness by smell and texture rather than a clock. This knowledge passes from one cook to the next, entirely through years of watching and doing, since no recipe of the period bothers to record the countless small judgments that separate a good meal from a merely edible one. The kitchen's fires never burn identically from one day to the next, and a good cook reads the day's particular conditions the way a sailor reads weather. Damp wood on a rainy day demands more careful tending and produces more smoke than the same wood would on a dry one. A strong wind outside can pull unpredictably at a kitchen's own smoke vent, occasionally sending a gust of it back into the room in a way that leaves everyone briefly coughing and blinking before the fire settles again into its usual steady draw. Waste from the kitchen, trimmings, bones, spoiled scraps, too far gone even for the dogs, is collected separately and disposed of well away from the working area, sometimes fed to pigs kept specifically for this purpose, sometimes simply buried or carted off entirely. A well-run kitchen takes this seriously, since scraps left to accumulate anywhere near the cooking fires quickly attract vermin and produce a smell that no amount of careful cooking elsewhere in the room could ever fully cover. Herb gardens kept close to the kitchen itself, tended usually by whoever oversees the cooking, supply a steady stream of fresh flavouring through the growing months, mint, sage, parsley, and others planted in a small protected plot where they can be reached quickly without a lengthy trip to the wider fields beyond the walls. This small patch of cultivated green, modest as it is, represents one of the only truly fragrant, deliberately pleasant smells the kitchen offers on an otherwise very functional, very smoky working day. A kitchen boy's first weeks of work are usually spent almost entirely on the least skilled tasks, fetching water, feeding the fire, scouring pots before he is trusted with anything closer to actual cooking, and this slow apprenticeship, unglamorous as it is, ensures that by the time he does finally handle food directly, he already understands the kitchen's rhythms, its dangers, and its constant demands as thoroughly as anyone born to the work. The particular hiss and crack of fat dripping from a roasting joint onto open coals below produces one of the kitchen's most immediately recognizable sounds, sharp and sudden against the steadier background hum of chopping and simmering. And it is often this single sound, more than any other, that tells everyone nearby exactly how the evening's centerpiece dish is coming along without anyone needing to actually look. On the rare evenings the household marks a genuine feast, whether for a holy day, a marriage, or the arrival of an important guest, every sense described so far in this story sharpens and multiplies at once until the great hall becomes something closer to a single overwhelming experience than a collection of separate details. The smoke thickens, since more candles and a larger fire are needed to properly light and warm a hall now filled well beyond its usual number. The smell of roasting meat, ordinarily rare, fills the space entirely, layered with spices that spend most of the year locked away and rationed. Trumpets or horns often announce the arrival of each new course, a small ceremonial flourish that serves a genuinely practical purpose as well, since a hall full of conversation, music, and the general noise of celebration might otherwise miss the moment a new dish arrives from the kitchen. This announcement, sharp and bright against the general murmur of the room, cuts through the noise cleanly enough for even the furthest table to notice. Spices saved carefully throughout the year finally see use on a night like this, saffron lending its distinctive golden color and faintly earthy flavor to a dish reserved for the high table, pepper and cinnamon appearing in quantities that would seem almost reckless on an ordinary evening. The smell of these spices, unfamiliar to noses accustomed mostly to bread, pottage and wood smoke, marks the evening as something set entirely apart from the household's usual rhythm before a single dish has even been tasted. Music fills whatever gaps the trumpets and conversation leave behind. A minstrel or two, sometimes part of the household and sometimes travelling performers welcomed in specifically for the occasion, provide song and instrumental accompaniment through much of the evening, their music competing, not always successfully, with the general roar of a hall full of people determined to enjoy themselves after a long stretch of more ordinary days. The sheer number of courses served at a proper feast can feel almost bewildering to a household accustomed to a single pot of pottage most evenings. Course after course arrives from the kitchen, roasted meats, elaborate pastries, sometimes dishes shaped and decorated to resemble something entirely different from their actual ingredients, a form of culinary theatre intended as much to impress as to nourish. Wine flows considerably more freely on a night like this than the household's usual weak ale, and its effect on the noise level of the hall is immediate and unmistakable. Conversation grows louder, laughter more frequent, the whole room's energy building steadily as the evening progresses until the careful acoustics of the stone hall, discussed already for how clearly they carry an ordinary voice, are pushed to something closer to a continuous cheerful roar. Beneath the table, the dogs have their own feast night as well, since a larger, richer meal means considerably more scraps finding their way to the floor than on an ordinary evening. Bones stripped of roasted meat, bread soaked in rich sauce, all of it disappears quickly into waiting mouths that have learned through long experience exactly which nights are worth the extra attention. The rushes underfoot, freshly strewn before the feast began, take on a rather different character by the evening's end, trodden thoroughly with spilled wine, dropped food, and the sheer volume of foot traffic that a fuller than usual hall generates. Tomorrow's cleaning will be considerably more thorough than most, though tonight nobody spares it a single thought. As the evening finally winds down, the intensity of the feast gradually loosens its grip on the hall. Music slows, conversation quiets by degrees rather than all at once. The candles, burned steadily for hours now, begin to gutter and shorten, and the smoke that thickened so noticeably earlier in the evening starts, slowly, to thin again as the largest of the fires is allowed to settle toward embers. By the time the last guests have either retired to their chambers or settled onto pallets for the night, the hall that only hours before rang with trumpets and laughter has returned almost entirely to its ordinary quiet, the spices and roasted meat now only a lingering warmth in the air, the kind of scent that will still be faintly noticeable tomorrow morning to anyone who steps inside before the doors are opened to air the room properly. Sugar, on the rare occasion it appears at all, arrives not as a common sweetener, but as something closer to a spice in its own right, imported at considerable expense and used sparingly enough that a dish finished with it becomes instantly one of the evening's most talked about courses long after the feast itself has ended. Seating at a feast follows its own carefully understood order, one that says as much about status and relationship as any spoken introduction could. Proximity to the high table and to the lord and his most honoured guests seated upon it is arranged with real deliberation, and a guest seated further down the hall than they expected notices the slight immediately, whatever polite face they manage to keep through the rest of the evening. Entertainment beyond music sometimes fills the gaps between courses as well. A traveling storyteller recounting some well-loved tale, a display of tumbling or juggling if performers happen to be available, even, on the grandest occasions, a small staged pageant acting out some scene from history or scripture. These interludes give the kitchen staff crucial time to prepare the next course properly, while giving the hall itself something new to focus its attention on beyond simply eating and drinking. The morning after a great feast brings its own distinct atmosphere to the hall, tables not yet reassembled, rushes still bearing the marks of the night before, a lingering trace of spice and roasted meat in the air mixing oddly with the ordinary morning smell of a fresh, more modest fire being coaxed back to life for breakfast, the whole room caught for an hour or two between one rhythm and the next. A feast's success is measured, among the household's senior servants at least, almost as much by how smoothly the kitchen managed the relentless timing of so many courses as by how impressed the guests appeared to be, a private professional pride taken in work that the guests themselves, absorbed in music and conversation, rarely think to notice or credit at all. By the time the very last guest has finally been shown to a bed or a pallet for the night, the hall itself often bears little resemblance to the bright, crowded room it was only hours earlier, candles burned down to stubs, the fire settling toward embers, a lingering warmth in the air that will take until well past midnight to fully fade, the whole space slowly exhaling after the sustained effort of hosting so full and so festive an evening. Not every feast is planned weeks in advance. An unexpected arrival of sufficient importance can sometimes prompt a household to assemble something resembling a feast on considerably shorter notice, the kitchen staff working at a pace even more frantic than usual, the household's best remaining stores pressed into service without the luxury of careful advance planning, and somehow, more often than not, a genuinely respectable evening still manages to come together by the time the doors open and the first course is called. Climb the stairs away from the great hall and its constant crowd, and the castle changes character almost immediately. Private chambers belonging to the lord, his family, and occasionally an honoured guest are smaller, quieter, and considerably harder to heat than the hall below, since a single small fire or a portable brazier must now do the work that an entire central hearth performs downstairs. Braziers, shallow metal pans filled with burning charcoal, are a common solution in these smaller rooms, offering a source of heat that requires no chimney and can be moved from one part of a room to another as needed. Charcoal burns differently from the wood used in the hall below, producing far less visible smoke but carrying its own faint, mineral smell and its own quiet danger, since a brazier burning through the night in a poorly ventilated chamber can, on rare and tragic occasions, prove fatal to sleepers who never wake to notice anything wrong. The bed itself, in a chamber like this, is often the single most valuable piece of furniture in the entire household, and its curtains matter every bit as much as its frame. Heavy fabric hung on all four sides, drawn closed once its occupants have settled for the night, traps warmth close to the body far more effectively than any fire alone could manage across an entire drafty room, while also blocking out both the draft that finds its way under every door and the low residual light from a dying fire nearby. Feathers, where they can be afforded in sufficient quantity, fill the mattress and the pillows of a lord's bed, offering a softness that stands in sharp contrast to almost everything else in the room. Beneath the feathers, warm woolen blankets, and sometimes furs, complete the arrangement, layered thickly enough that a well-appointed medieval bed, curtains drawn, can feel almost like a small room within a room, entirely separate from the cold stone chamber surrounding it. Servants and lower members of the household sleep very differently, and the difference is not subtle. A straw-filled pallet, sometimes little more than a sack stuffed with dried straw or rushes, serves as both mattress and, in the coldest months, as much of a household's actual insulation against the cold floor beneath. It crackles and shifts with every movement through the night, a dry, papery rustle that becomes, to anyone who sleeps on one for years, as familiar and unremarkable as silence itself would be to someone who had never known anything else. Privacy, in the sense a much later century would come to expect it, barely exists for most of the household. Servants often sleep together in shared spaces, sometimes in the very hall where they worked all day, pallets laid out once the trestle tables have been cleared and stacked against the wall. Even within the lord's own household, a personal attendant might sleep on a small pallet directly across the threshold of the private chamber, close enough to hear if summoned in the night. If you have found your own way into this world tonight through listening rather than reading, it is worth knowing that the same is true of every story in this collection, all of it recorded in full and waiting on Spotify, the link sitting quietly in the description or the pinned comment for whenever curiosity strikes again. For all this closeness, or perhaps because of it, the private chamber still represents a meaningful step apart from the noise and crowd of the hall below. A closed door, even one without a lock in the modern sense, signals something. A single small fire, however modest compared to the great hearth downstairs, belongs to this room and this room only. The particular hush of a chamber removed from the hall, its own smaller pocket of warmth and shadow, offers a kind of rest that the hall itself, for all its warmth and company, can never quite provide. Wall hangings in these smaller rooms serve the same dual purpose they serve below, softening both sound and cold, though on a more intimate scale suited to a much smaller space. A single well-chosen tapestry, perhaps depicting a hunting scene or a scattering of flowers against a dark ground, can transform the whole feel of a chamber, catching what little candlelight the room holds and returning it softly rather than letting the bare stones swallow it entirely. By the time the household has fully settled for the night, the difference between the crowded warmth of the hall and the quieter, more contained warmth of the private chambers above becomes one of the clearest sensory boundaries in the entire castle, one crossed simply by climbing a single flight of stairs, and yet felt, by anyone who makes that climb, as a genuinely different world. A truly cold night sometimes drives even the household's cats up from their usual haunts near the kitchen fire to curl instead at the foot of whichever bed offers the warmest refuge, tolerated there by most families as simply one more small practical accommodation to winter, no different in spirit from an extra fur laid across the feet. A private chamber's single window, where one exists, becomes the subject of careful daily calculation through the coldest months, opened briefly each morning to clear the stale air of a night spent behind closed bed curtains, then shuttered again quickly before too much of the room's hard-won warmth has a chance to escape into the cold outside. This brief daily airing, performed almost without thinking by whoever tends the chamber, keeps the room from growing too close and stale, despite being sealed so thoroughly against the weather for the rest of each day. The particular hush of a private chamber at night owes something as well to simple distance from the rest of the household's activity. Sounds that would be immediate and unavoidable in the crowded hall below, a raised voice, a dropped pot, a dog's bark, arrive here muffled by intervening walls and floors, softened into something closer to a distant murmur than any sound demanding attention. One more small mercy that a private chamber offers its occupants over the shared, ever-audible life of the hall. A lord's personal attendant, sleeping close by the threshold of the private chamber, occupies a strange middle position within the household's sleeping arrangements, neither fully part of the crowded hall below, nor granted a private space of his own, present specifically so that a single call in the night can be answered within moments rather than requiring a long, cold walk down the stairs to rouse anyone else. The particular quiet of a private chamber becomes, for a lord or lady who has spent an entire day surrounded by the noise and demands of a crowded household, one of the genuine small luxuries their position affords them, a closed door and a single small room where nobody expects an immediate answer or an immediate decision, if only for the few hours between retiring and sleep. A cold hand pressed briefly against a warm cheek just before the bed curtains are finally drawn closed for the night is, for many households, as close as this world comes to a bedtime ritual in any sentimental sense, a small, wordless gesture of care exchanged between parent and child or between partners before the curtains fall and the small warm world inside them closes off entirely from the cold chamber beyond. Clothing in this world is not chosen so much as accumulated layer by layer, each piece serving a specific practical purpose rather than any particular aesthetic one, though aesthetics are never entirely absent, even among people who spend most of their day working outdoors in whatever weather arrives. Against the skin, closest of all, sits a garment of linen, worn by nearly everyone regardless of rank, since wool alone against bare skin proves uncomfortable for almost anyone within a single day. That linen layer absorbs sweat and body oil in a way wool cannot, and it is, correspondingly, the layer washed most frequently of anything a person owns. Even households with only modest means for laundry tend to prioritize this innermost garment, understanding, even without any formal theory of hygiene, that a body kept reasonably clean beneath its outer layers stays healthier and more comfortable than one that is not. Wool forms the bulk of what sits over that linen base, heavy and warm, and for anyone unaccustomed to it, noticeably rough against the skin wherever it happens to touch directly. The texture varies considerably depending on how finely the wool has been processed. A coarse, unrefined weave, common among households of modest means, can feel almost abrasive at the wrists and neck, while a more finely combed and woven wool, available to those who can afford it, softens considerably, though never quite to the point of feeling truly gentle. Dye colors depend heavily on what plants and minerals a given region can supply, and the resulting palette runs toward earthy, muted tones far more often than the vivid colors later centuries would come to associate with medieval pageantry. Brown, dull green, and a range of soft ochres and greys dominate the everyday wardrobe of most of the household, reserved almost entirely from the brighter, more expensive dyes that require rarer, more costly ingredients to produce. Fastenings present their own small daily ritual, since buttons in the modern sense remain uncommon for much of this period. Garments are laced, pinned, wrapped, and tied instead, a process that often requires a second pair of hands, whether a family member's or a servant's, particularly for anything fitted closely at the back or sides. Dressing, for much of the household, is rarely a solitary act, simply by virtue of how the clothing itself is constructed. Footwear varies enormously by both rank and season. Simple leather shoes, sometimes little more than a single piece of hide wrapped and laced around the foot, serve most of the household for daily wear, offering only modest protection against mud, cold, and the countless small hazards of a working castle's floors and yards. Wooden clogs, raised slightly above the worst of the mud, offer another option in the wetter months, clattering distinctly against stone floors in a way leather shoes never quite manage. Head coverings matter as much for practicality as for any social convention attached to them. A simple linen cap or veil keeps hair contained and reasonably clean during a day of physical labor, while also offering a small measure of warmth against a draft that finds its way into every corner of a castle sooner or later. In the coldest months, a hood or wrapped scarf adds another layer entirely, covering the ears and neck against a chill that seems to originate from the stone itself rather than merely the outside air. Furs, where the household's means allow them, are reserved primarily for the coldest months and the most important occasions, lining a cloak or trimming a collar rather than forming an entire garment, since fur in sufficient quantity to construct a full outfit represents an investment far beyond what most households could reasonably justify. The texture against the skin, soft in a way wool never quite achieves, marks these garments immediately as something set apart from the everyday. Laundry day, discussed already for its effect on the whole household's rhythm, leaves its own particular mark on the feel of clothing afterward. Freshly washed wool, dried outdoors over a hedge or bush when the weather allows, carries a clean, faintly grassy smell and a texture noticeably softer than clothing that has gone several weeks between washings, stiffened gradually by accumulated sweat, smoke, and the general residue of daily life. By the time winter fully sets in, most people in the castle are wearing very nearly everything they own at once, layer stacked upon layer, until the shape of the body beneath becomes almost impossible to guess at from the silhouette alone. It is not an elegant solution, and it is rarely a comfortable one in any way a later century would recognize as comfort, but it works, and in a world without any better alternative, working is very nearly everything. A garment's age can often be read plainly in its color, since even the sturdiest dyes fade gradually with repeated washing and long exposure to smoke and sunlight, meaning a household's oldest, most patched pieces of clothing tend to settle over years into a similar faded, muted family of tones regardless of what bright color they may have started as. Repairing clothing rather than replacing it outright occupies a considerable portion of the household's quiet evening hours, since even a modestly wealthy family cannot easily justify discarding a garment simply because it has torn or thinned in one spot. A skilled hand with a needle can extend a garment's useful life by years, patching, reinforcing, and occasionally reworking an older piece entirely into something smaller for a growing child, so that very little woven cloth in a household like this ever truly goes to waste. Children's clothing in particular tends to pass through several hands before it is finally worn out beyond any further use, handed down from an older sibling to a younger one, taken in or let out as needed, patched at the knees and elbows where a young body's constant movement wears fabric fastest. A garment's history in a household like this is often as long and as well remembered as the garment itself is well worn. A traveling peddler passing through occasionally brings small luxuries otherwise unavailable locally, a length of finer cloth, a set of proper metal pins to replace simple wooden ones, and these small purchases, modest as they are remembered and mentioned for months afterward by whichever household member finally gets to use them. A rare small novelty in a wardrobe built mostly from necessity and careful repair rather than any regular fresh purchase. A single good cloak, well made and properly lined, represents enough of an investment that it is expected to last its owner many years, mended and adjusted as needed rather than replaced, and a household member fortunate enough to own one treats it accordingly, brushed clean after wear, hung carefully rather than simply dropped in a heap, a small daily ritual of care for what is, in practical terms, one of their most valuable possessions. A particularly harsh winter sometimes forces even a reasonably comfortable household to improvise. Old blankets repurposed as extra layers, worn cloaks doubled up rather than replaced, whatever spare wool can be found pressed into service against a cold that shows no sign of relenting. There is no shame attached to this kind of practical improvisation. Everyone in the household, from the Lord's own family down to the newest servant, understands that surviving a hard winter well has always mattered considerably more than looking elegant while doing it. Of every room within the castle walls, the chapel holds itself apart most consistently, and this separateness is felt through the senses as clearly as it is understood in any spiritual sense. Where the great hall smells of smoke and roasted meat and rushes, the chapel smells instead of beeswax, since even the humblest household reserves its finest candles for the altar and of incense on the days it is used. A sweet resinous smoke entirely different in character from the wood smoke that fills every other room in the building. The chapel is also, almost without exception, the coldest room in the entire castle. It is used for shorter, more scheduled periods than the hall or the kitchen, its fire, where one exists at all, kept modest and often unlit outside of the coldest services. Stone floors here are rarely softened with rushes the way the hall's floor is, since a bare stone floor is considered more fitting for a place of worship, which means the chapel's particular cold reaches through the soles of the feet with an intensity found almost nowhere else in the building. Sound behaves differently here as well. A smaller room than the hall, often with a higher, narrower vault overhead, the chapel returns a voice with a sharper, more concentrated echo, one that seems to gather every word spoken and hold it briefly in the air before letting it fade. A chaplain's voice, reciting the same prayers day after day, takes on a particular resonance in this space that it would lose entirely if spoken in the noisier, more absorbent great hall. Stone effigies, where the household's wealth and history allow for them, lie in quiet rows along the chapel walls or set into the floor itself, carved likenesses of earlier lords and their families, cool and smooth beneath a curious hand. Children raised in the castle often grow up entirely used to these silent stone figures, treating them with a mixture of genuine reverence and the same casual familiarity they might extend to any other permanent fixture of a room they have known their whole lives. The bells that govern the household's daily rhythm, discussed already for their role in marking the canonical hours, originate here, rung by whoever holds that particular duty within the chapel itself. Standing close to the chapel during the moment of ringing means experiencing the bell not simply as a distant sound carried across the castle, but as something closer to a physical presence, felt in the chest as much as heard by the ear. On ordinary days, the chapel sees only brief use, a handful of prayers said quickly by whoever has a moment to spare between other duties. On holy days, it fills considerably fuller, incense burning more generously than usual, candles multiplied well beyond the modest daily allowance, the whole small room transformed for a few hours into something closer, in its own quiet way, to the feast the great hall might host on the very same occasion. By the time evening prayers have concluded and the chapel empties again, its particular cold and quiet settle back in almost immediately, the incense fading slowly over the following hours until only the faintest trace remains for whoever happens to pass by early the next morning, one more small, familiar layer in the castle's constantly shifting, endlessly particular collection of smells. Even the youngest children in the household, who might otherwise wriggle and fidget through almost any other quiet moment in their day, tend to settle noticeably once inside the chapel, whether from genuine reverence, simple imitation of the adults around them, or the particular hush that a cold stone room lit only by candlelight seems to encourage in almost anyone who steps inside it. The chaplain responsible for the household's spiritual life occupies a curious position within the castle's daily rhythm, moving between the hushed formality of the chapel and the noisy, practical business of the hall with an ease that few other members of the household need to manage across quite so wide a range. His voice, capable of the sharp, deliberate resonance the chapel demands, must also carry clearly enough to be heard over a crowded feast when called upon to offer a blessing before the first course arrives. Candle wax gathered from the chapel's own burned-down stubs is rarely wasted, saved and sometimes melted down again for reuse in humbler tallow candles elsewhere in the household, a small, practical recycling that quietly blurs the line between the chapel's costly beeswax and the great hall's cheaper everyday light, at least at the very margins where one supply happens to run short and the other has a little extra to spare. A newly appointed chaplain, arriving at a household for the first time, often needs a season or two before he fully learns the particular rhythm this chapel keeps, when the household expects a longer service and when a brief one will do, which days call for incense and which manage well enough without it, small local customs that vary from one castle to the next, despite the shared underlying faith they all serve. A castle's chapel bell, heard clearly across the entire complex of walls and towers, serves the wider countryside beyond the castle as well on certain occasions, its tone recognized by nearby villages as marking not just the household's own prayers but shared moments of the wider community's religious calendar, one small way the castle's private rhythm reaches out past its own walls. A quiet moment alone in the chapel, stolen by someone from the household during an otherwise ordinary working day, offers a kind of solitude genuinely difficult to find anywhere else within these crowded walls, cold and still and entirely private in a way that no bed curtain, however heavy, can quite replicate for a household member seeking a few minutes truly apart from everyone else. By the time the chapel's own single candle has been carried away for the night, its stone floor and quiet rows of effigies settle into a darkness even more complete than the great hall's, since no banked hearth glows here to soften it, nothing but cold stone and cooler air, and the faint, lingering trace of incense from whatever service was last held within these particular walls. Patient and unhurried, waiting for morning prayers to return and fill the small room with sound again. If your eyes have already closed once or twice by now, that is exactly the point of a story like this one. There is no need to fight it. Subscribing simply keeps a story like this waiting for the next night you need it, and there is always a next night. Let the hall grow quieter still. Step out of the hall entirely and into the open ground of the bailey, and the castle's soundscape changes again, trading the close layered echo of stone rooms for something wider and more scattered across open air. This is the working heart of the castle, the space between the outer curtain wall and the keep itself, and during the daylight hours it rarely falls quiet for long. The blacksmith's forge announces itself before you ever see it, a rhythmic ringing of hammer against hot iron that carries a surprising distance across open ground, punctuated by the hiss of metal plunged into a water trough to cool. A castle of any size needs a smith close at hand constantly, for horseshoes, for tools, for the endless small repairs any working household requires, and his hammer becomes, over time, one more thread in the bailey's daily rhythm, audible from the wall walk above and even faintly from certain rooms within the keep itself. Nearby, a well shaft drops deep into the ground, its windlass creaking with a slow wooden groan each time a bucket is lowered and raised, a sound so ordinary that nobody consciously registers it anymore, though its absence, on the rare day the well needs repair and water must be carried from further afield instead, is noticed by everyone almost immediately. Livestock kept within the bailey walls, whether for the household's own use or held there temporarily during times of siege or unrest, add their own layer of sound and unmistakably their own layer of smell. Chickens scratch and cluck near whatever scraps the kitchen has discarded. A few pigs, if kept, root through anything edible with an enthusiasm that requires constant supervision. The particular warm, earthy smell of animals kept in close quarters drifts across the bailey depending entirely on which way the wind happens to be blowing on a given day. Dogs move through this space as freely as they move through the hall, though the bailey's dogs tend to be working animals first, guarding livestock or alerting the household to any unfamiliar approach, their bark carrying easily across open ground and often serving as the very first warning of an arriving visitor, well before any gatehouse watchman has finished his own call. The gatehouse itself contributes some of the most distinctive sounds in the entire castle. The heavy chain and mechanism of the portcullis, raised and lowered at set times each day, produces a deep, grinding rattle, audible throughout the bailey, and often within the keep as well. A sound so tied to the rhythm of opening and closing the castle for the day that households sometimes set other routines, like the start of the morning's labour, loosely around it. At night, once the gates have been closed and barred, the bailey quiets considerably, though it is never entirely silent. A watchman posted along the curtain wall calls out at intervals through the darkest hours, a practice repeated in castles and walled towns across the period specifically to reassure everyone within earshot that the walls remain guarded and no danger has gone unnoticed. His voice, carrying alone across an otherwise empty bailey, is one of the more haunting sounds a castle produces after dark, in the gentlest possible sense of that word. Weather changes the character of the bailey more dramatically than almost anywhere else in the castle, since so much of the daily work happening there takes place entirely in the open air. Rain turns the packed earth to mud within minutes, mud that clings to boots and cartwheels alike, and that everyone entering the keep afterward must scrape off, however imperfectly, before tracking it any further inside. Snow muffles the bailey's usual sounds almost entirely, softening the ring of the smith's hammer and the creak of the well's windlass into something quieter and more distant than usual. By the last hour before full darkness, the bailey's daytime bustle has usually thinned to just a handful of final tasks, the smith banking his forge for the night, the last cart of firewood or water hauled in before the gates close, a few remaining chickens herded back toward whatever shelter keeps them safe until morning. The sounds do not stop all at once. They taper, one small task ending after another, until only the watchman's periodic call remains to mark the passing hours. The bailey's working animals extend, in some castles, to include falcons kept for hunting, housed in their own small mews near the hall, their occasional sharp cries adding one more distinctive voice to the bailey's daytime chorus, quite unlike anything produced by dog, goose or hammer, and instantly recognizable to anyone who has spent time around a household that keeps them. The bailey's daily rhythm shifts noticeably with the agricultural calendar beyond the castle walls, since much of what happens within them exists in direct service to the fields, flocks, and harvests that sustain the wider household. Harvest season brings carts creaking under loads of grain through the gate at all hours, the bailey suddenly busier and louder than usual as the whole household turns its attention toward gathering in enough to last through the coming winter's leaner months. A castle under threat, however briefly, transforms its bailey almost beyond recognition. Livestock from the surrounding countryside driven inside the walls for safekeeping, the usual working sounds of smith and mill nearly drowned beneath the bleating, lowing, and general commotion of animals unfamiliar with their new, crowded surroundings. This crowding rarely lasts long, but while it does, the bailey's ordinary character disappears almost entirely beneath the noise and smell of an entire district's livestock pressed inside one set of walls at once. Weekly or seasonal fairs, when they fall within a castle's own bailey rather than a nearby town, transform the space almost entirely for a day or two. Temporary stalls crowding the usual open ground, the noise and smell of visiting traders and their goods briefly overwhelming even the blacksmith's hammer and the well's steady creak, before the whole arrangement packs away again and the bailey returns, gradually, to its familiar everyday rhythm. A castle's bailey, for all its noise and constant activity, also serves as the household's primary open space for anything requiring real room, training with weapons for those whose duty requires it, exercising horses too large or too restless for the confines of the stable, even on rare occasions a modest tournament or contest arranged for a particular celebration, the whole space temporarily repurposed for an afternoon before returning to its usual working rhythm. Even the bailey's dust, kicked up by hooves and cartwheels through a long dry summer, carries its own particular smell, dry and faintly mineral, settling over everything, clothing, stored goods, the very stones underfoot, until the first proper autumn rain finally washes it away, and the whole bailey seems, for a day or two afterward, unusually clean and quiet by comparison. The bailey's silence at night is never quite the same silence twice, shaped as much by the season and the weather as by the hour itself. A clear, still winter night carries sound further and more sharply than a damp summer one, meaning the watchman's call on a frozen January evening can sometimes be heard clearly from almost anywhere within the walls, while the same call on a thick, humid August night seems to dissolve into the warm air only a short distance from where it was spoken. Long before a rider ever comes into view, the castle often already knows someone is approaching. A watchman posted on the gatehouse tower, scanning the road below as a matter of daily routine, spots movement in the distance and raises the alarm with a single blast of a horn, a sound built specifically to cut through wind and distance in a way the human voice alone cannot manage. That horn call sets off a small, practiced sequence of activity throughout the bailey below. A groom moves toward the stable in case the visitor arrives on a spent horse needing immediate care. Whoever oversees the household's hospitality begins, almost automatically, calculating what can be offered depending on who this turns out to be. The portcullis mechanism, silent until now, begins its own slow, grinding preparation in case it needs to be raised. When the rider finally does clatter across the drawbridge, the sound changes noticeably from anything heard on the approach road. Hooves on packed earth produce a soft, muffled thud. Hooves on the drawbridge's heavy timber planking ring out instead with a hollow, resonant clatter entirely their own, distinct enough that anyone inside the keep with an ear for it can tell, without looking, the exact moment a horse has crossed from open ground onto the bridge itself. The stable, tucked usually against one wall of the bailey, carries a smell entirely its own within the castle's wider landscape of scents, warm and sweetly organic, hay and horse and leather tack layered together into something that a groom who spends all day there stops noticing entirely, and that a visitor arriving from elsewhere often finds surprisingly pleasant compared to some of the castle's other, less forgiving smells. A horse ridden hard over some distance arrives carrying its own story on its coat, lathered with sweat, dusty or mud-splattered depending on the road and the season, breathing hard in a way that any experienced groom reads instantly for signs of how urgent or how leisurely the journey behind it actually was. The horse is unsaddled, walked to cool gradually rather than left standing while still overheated, brushed down, and finally settled with feed and water, a whole small ritual of care completed before anyone thinks to ask the rider a single question about their journey. Leather tack, oiled periodically to keep it supple against the damp, adds its own particular smell to the stable air, along with the metallic tang of horseshoes and the various tools kept close at hand for the frequent small repairs a working stable demands. A saddle left too long unused grows stiff and needs working back into flexibility before it can be trusted again on a long ride. News, of course, travels alongside every rider who arrives at the gate, and the arrival horn means something to the whole household well beyond its practical logistics. It means fresh gossip for the servants working the kitchen and the well. It might mean a letter for the Lord, sealed with wax and carried carefully the whole distance. It might mean nothing more than a merchant seeking a night's shelter before continuing on his route the next morning. By the time the visitor has been settled, whether in the hall for a meal or a private chamber for the night, and the horse has been fully tended in the stable, the brief flurry of activity the horn set in motion has already faded back into the castle's ordinary rhythm, ready to repeat itself in exactly the same practice sequence the very next time a distant rider appears on the road below. A groom experienced enough to read a tired horse at a glance can often guess with real accuracy roughly how far and how urgently that horse has travelled that day, information the rider himself has not yet had a chance to offer, simply from the particular pattern of sweat and dust across its coat and the depth of its breathing as it is finally led toward rest. Not every arrival announced by the gatehouse horn turns out to be welcome, and the household's practice sequence of preparation includes quietly a readiness for that possibility as well. A watchman's tone and the particular pattern of his call can convey, to those experienced enough to read it, something of the visitor's apparent size and intent well before any formal challenge is exchanged at the gate itself, giving the household precious extra moments to prepare for whatever kind of guest is actually approaching. Messengers travelling on urgent business sometimes arrive at hours when the gate would ordinarily remain closed for the night, and a household maintains some agreed method, a particular horn signal, a password exchanged through a small grill set into the gate itself for admitting a legitimate late arrival without simply throwing open the defences to anyone who happens to knock after dark. A rider who arrives at genuine speed, horse thoroughly lathered and clearly pushed hard over some distance, tells the household something is seriously amiss well before a single word has been exchanged, and the whole practice sequence of hospitality, feed the horse, offer food and rest to the rider, shifts almost instantly into something more urgent. The steward and often the lord himself drawn quickly toward the gate rather than waiting comfortably in the hall for news to reach them. A household's stable hands develop over years an almost wordless communication with the animals in their care, reading a horse's mood and condition through small details a less experienced eye would miss entirely, a slight favoring of one leg, an ear held at an unusual angle, small signals that, caught early, can mean the difference between a minor issue resolved quickly and a genuinely serious one discovered too late. Long after a rider has been settled for the night and their horse properly tended in the stable, a trace of the journey often lingers faintly in the Bailey air, dust not yet fully settled, a whiff of horse and leather not yet dispersed, small evidence of the evening's brief excitement slowly fading back into the castle's ordinary rhythm alongside everything else the day has already absorbed and set aside. Long after the last rider of the day has been settled and the gatehouse horn has fallen silent for the night, the road beyond the castle walls empties entirely, dark and quiet under whatever moon happens to be rising, waiting, as it always does, for whichever traveller tomorrow brings, a rider with news, a merchant with goods, a stranger with nothing more urgent than a night's shelter before continuing on toward wherever their own journey is actually headed. Below the great hall, often partly sunk beneath the level of the bailey outside, lies the undercroft, a low, vaulted storage space holding much of what the household needs to survive the long stretch between one harvest and the next. The air here is entirely different from anywhere else in the castle, cool and faintly damp year-round, carrying the mingled smell of dried fish, salted meat, stored grain, and the particular must of stone that rarely sees direct daylight. Barrels of salted meat and fish line one section, preserved through a process that leaves its own sharp, briny smell hanging heavily in the confined air, strong enough that a servant sent down for a single evening's provisions often emerges again still carrying a trace of it on their clothes. Grain sacks, stacked carefully off the damp floor on wooden pallets or raised platforms, fill another section, their dry, dusty smell a welcome contrast to the sharper scents nearby. Apples and other stored fruit, wrapped individually in straw to keep one spoiling piece from ruining its neighbours, contribute a faint sweetness to the undercroft's air that shifts noticeably as autumn's fresh harvest gradually gives way, over the following months, to whatever remains still edible by late winter. By the final weeks before spring, this particular smell has usually faded almost entirely, the fruit long since eaten or spoiled and cleared away. Sound down here differs from the rest of the castle in its own way, muffled and close, the thick vaulted ceiling and the partial burial below ground level, absorbing noise far more thoroughly than the open stone of the hall above. A voice raised in the undercroft sounds strange even to the person speaking it, flattened and near, without any of the natural resonance the same voice would carry upstairs. Rats present a constant, quiet battle in a space holding this much stored food, and the castle's cats earn a considerable portion of their keep patrolling exactly these rooms, moving silently between the barrels and sacks at all hours, doing work that goes almost entirely unacknowledged, yet matters enormously to a household that cannot afford to lose its winter stores to vermin. Dampness is the undercroft's most persistent enemy, seeping up through stone floors set partly below ground and settling into anything left too long without proper airflow. A steward responsible for these stores checks regularly for the telltale musty smell of mold beginning to take hold in a sack of grain or a store of dried herbs, since catching the problem early can mean the difference between a minor loss and a genuinely serious one before winter's end. By the coldest, leanest weeks of late winter, the undercroft has usually been drawn down considerably from its full autumn abundance, rows of barrels and sacks noticeably thinner than they were only a few months before. Everyone in the household, from the lord down to the newest kitchen servant, watches these dwindling stores with a shared, largely unspoken awareness of exactly how much longer they need to last before the first fresh growth of spring finally arrives to replace them. A truly hard winter, one that stretches later than expected before the first spring growth arrives, can turn the Undercroft's dwindling stores into the single most pressing concern in the entire household, discussed quietly among the senior servants with a seriousness that the feasting and hallside gossip of autumn rarely hinted was ever coming. Certain foods stored down here carry a smell distinctive enough to identify a household's particular provisions almost blindfolded. Onions and garlic, hung in braided strings from the low ceiling to keep them clear of the damp floor, perfume the whole space with a sharpness that never quite fades, mingling constantly with the brinier smell of the salted meat barrels nearby into a combination entirely unique to this one room. A steward's careful accounting of these stores, tallied and retallied through the winter months, represents one of the household's most consequential quiet responsibilities, since a miscalculation discovered too late, stores that run out weeks before the first spring growth arrives, threatens far more than mere inconvenience for everyone who depends on this single underground room to see them safely through to another harvest. Dried herbs, stored here for both cooking and simple household remedies, hang alongside the onions and garlic, their fainter, more varied scents easily lost beneath the stronger smells of salted meat and stored grain, unless a visitor happens to brush directly past the bundle, releasing for just a moment a small cloud of something considerably gentler than everything else the Undercroft usually offers the nose. A particularly good harvest year leaves the Undercroft fuller than usual well into the following spring, a small welcome cushion against whatever the next year's harvest might bring, and a household experienced enough to remember leaner years treats this surplus with real gratitude rather than any careless assumption that such abundance is guaranteed to repeat itself. When spring finally arrives and the first fresh growth appears in the fields beyond the walls, the Undercroft's long winter test quietly concludes for another year, its emptied barrels and thinned sacks standing as the clearest possible record of exactly how the household weighed its needs against its stores, and exactly how carefully, or how narrowly, it managed to see everyone safely through to the other side. Down in the Undercroft tonight, exactly as every other night, the barrels and sacks sit undisturbed in the dark, their careful inventory unchanged until morning, the whole quiet room doing nothing more than holding, patiently, everything the household will need to reach for again once daylight and appetite return together, as they always do, however far off that particular morning might currently feel from inside tonight's stillness. There is a particular kind of cold that only stone produces, and anyone who has spent a winter inside a castle knows it intimately, even if they never found the words to describe it precisely. It is not the sharp, immediate cold of stepping outside into snow. It is slower, deeper, and far more patient, a cold that seeps up through the soles of your feet from floor slabs that have not felt real warmth since the previous summer, and that presses in from every wall regardless of how close you sit to the fire. Stone, once thoroughly chilled through a long winter, holds that cold with remarkable stubbornness. A single evening's fire, however large, warms the air of a room far more readily than it warms the stone enclosing that air, which means the walls themselves remain noticeably cold to the touch long after the room has grown comfortable enough to sit in without a cloak. Press a bare hand against an interior wall in February, and the chill of it can still, even briefly, take your breath. Wind finds its way into this equation constantly, since a building designed first and foremost for defense was never built with airtightness in mind. Arrow loops, narrow slits cut through thick walls specifically to allow a defender to see and shoot outward while remaining protected, channel any passing wind into a thin, distinctive whistle, a sound so consistent on a blustery day that some households claim to judge an approaching storm's strength by its pitch alone. Doors, however solidly built, rarely fit their frames with any real precision by later standards, and the gap beneath even the sturdiest door allows a steady thread of cold air to creep across the floor throughout the coldest months. Heavy curtains hung directly over doorways, a common solution in wealthier households, help considerably, catching and slowing that draft before it can spread far into the room beyond. Windows, where they exist at all beyond the simplest wooden shutters, present their own particular compromise. Glass, expensive and imperfect, distorts whatever light passes through it and is generally reserved for the chapel or the most important private chambers. Everywhere else, a household chooses between light and warmth rather than enjoying both together, shutters thrown open during the brief hours of daylight and firmly closed again well before dusk, sacrificing any view of the outside world in exchange for a slightly less punishing draft. Tapestries and wall hangings, already discussed for their effect on sound, matter just as much for their effect on warmth, forming a soft barrier between the room's occupants and the cold radiating steadily from bare stone behind them. A chamber hung generously with heavy cloth on every wall can feel, by the simple measure of comfort, like an entirely different room from an identical space left bare, even with the very same fire burning in both. Clothing itself becomes, through necessity, a form of architecture in its own right during the coldest months. Multiple layers of wool, worn one over another, trap warmth against the body in a way that mirrors, on a much smaller scale, the way a well-hung tapestry traps warmth within a room. A cloak lined with fur, where the household's means allow for one, adds a final layer that even the most persistent draft struggles to fully penetrate. Sleep itself in the coldest months becomes a carefully managed undertaking. Bed curtains drawn fully closed, extra blankets and furs piled thickly over straw or feather alike. Sometimes, in the humblest households, an entire family shares a single bed simply for the warmth generated by several bodies pressed close together through the night, a practical arrangement born of necessity rather than any particular closeness, though it likely produced a fair share of both over the years. By late winter, everyone within the castle walls has developed their own small private strategies against the persistent cold, favourite spots near the hearth claimed by unspoken habit, particular chairs turned just slightly to catch whatever warmth the fire offers without sitting so close as to scorch a cloak. These small adaptations, repeated night after night for an entire season, become so automatic that nobody consciously thinks about them at all, any more than they think about breathing. And then, eventually, spring arrives, and the cold that has lived so persistently in the stone all winter finally begins, slowly, to loosen its grip. The walls warm by degrees no one can quite pinpoint day to day, until one morning, without any single dramatic moment marking the change, the whole castle simply feels different against the skin than it did only a few weeks before. Certain corners of a castle earn over generations a settled reputation among the household for being colder than any reasonable explanation of drafts and stonework alone could account for, and more than one servant, pressed on the matter, will admit to a private theory involving something rather less practical than architecture to explain exactly why that particular passage never seems to warm no matter the season. A castle's builders understood the persistent cold of stone well enough to plan around it wherever they reasonably could, orienting the most important private chambers toward the sun's path where the building's defensive requirements allowed for such a choice, and positioning the thickest, most exposed walls to face whatever direction the coldest prevailing winds typically arrived from. None of this fully solves the problem, but it softens it in ways that anyone living in a well-sited castle benefits from, without necessarily ever knowing exactly why one particular chamber always seems to hold its warmth a little better than another. Ice itself becomes an unwelcome but entirely ordinary visitor to certain parts of the castle during the hardest weeks of winter, forming on the inside of window openings, along damp stretches of undercroft wall, occasionally even on water left standing too long in an unheated storeroom. Nobody treats this as remarkable. It is simply one more seasonal fact of stone architecture, noted, worked around, and generally ignored until the thaw finally arrives to undo it. A household's oldest members often speak of the cold in these terms most vividly of all, having felt the particular chill of this exact stone through more winters than anyone else currently living beneath the same roof, their memory of especially hard years passed down as a kind of informal record long before anyone thought to write such things down formally. A castle's thickest walls, built primarily for defense rather than comfort, paradoxically hold their cold most stubbornly of all, meaning the very stonework designed to keep a household safest from attack is often, in the dead of winter, the same stonework working hardest against anyone hoping to stay warm inside it. A quiet irony that nobody who actually lives through a hard winter here finds even slightly amusing. A body that has lived its entire life inside these cold stone walls develops over years its own quiet resilience to a chill that would genuinely shock a visitor arriving from a warmer, softer climate, not because the cold itself is any less real, but because long familiarity teaches a person exactly how to move, dress, and rest in a way that keeps its worst effects at arm's length, season after season, for an entire lifetime. A newcomer to the household, arriving for the first time in high summer, often cannot quite believe the warnings they are given about winter within these same walls, certain that stone this solid, this permanent, could not possibly grow as bitterly cold as everyone insists it will. By the following January, having learned otherwise firsthand, they rarely doubt it again, and are usually the ones offering the very same warning to whichever newcomer arrives next. Once the evening meal has been cleared and the household's business for the day has largely concluded, the Great Hall undergoes a transformation that repeats itself in one form or another every single night. The long trestle tables, simple boards set across removable supports rather than fixed furniture, are dismantled and stacked carefully against the wall, clearing the floor space they occupied only an hour or two before. Into that newly cleared space come the pallets, straw-filled and modest, laid out by servants who will themselves be sleeping on many of them once the work is finished. The Great Hall, a room that hosted feasting, judgment and conversation only a short while ago, becomes, for the hours between dusk and dawn, something closer to a single enormous shared bedroom, housing a good portion of the household's lower ranks who have no private chamber of their own to retire to. This nightly conversion is so routine that it happens with barely any spoken direction, each servant knowing their accustomed spot on the hall floor the way they know their accustomed place at table, close to the hearth if their rank or the cold weather warrants it, further toward the walls if not. Disputes over favoured sleeping spots do occur, inevitably, among a household of this size, but they are usually settled quickly, through habit and unspoken hierarchy rather than any prolonged argument. The evening bell, the same one that carries the old instruction to cover or bank the household's fires for the night, marks the formal close of the day's activity even for those who have already retired earlier. Once it rings, the largest fire in the hall is deliberately reduced, banked down into a bed of glowing embers covered partially with ash, enough to hold its heat through the night without the risk of an untended flame catching on nearby rushes or bedding while the whole household sleeps. This banking of the fire is a skill in its own right, one that balances two competing needs against each other with real precision. Bank it too aggressively, smothering the embers too thoroughly, and the hall wakes to a genuinely cold morning with a fire that must be rebuilt entirely from scratch. Bank it too lightly, and the risk of a spark escaping into the surrounding rushes during the night becomes real enough to worry any household that has heard stories, as most have, of a hall lost to exactly this kind of overnight accident. Once the fire has been properly banked and the last candles either snuffed or carried away to whichever private chambers still need them, the hall settles into a darkness broken only by the faint red glow of the embers themselves. Voices so numerous and constant only an hour before, quiet to occasional murmurs and then gradually to nothing at all beyond the soft rustle of straw as bodies settle and resettle, finding whatever position on the pallet offers the best combination of warmth and comfort for the hours ahead. Dogs claim their customary places near the last of the fire's warmth, curling into the same spots they have favoured for years, occasionally shifting to make room as a servant lies down nearby, an arrangement neither party seems to mind in the slightest after so many nights of practised coexistence. Somewhere in the darkness, a child too young to have fully learned the household's nightly rhythm might whisper a question to a parent lying nearby, answered in a hushed voice that carries only as far as it needs to before falling silent again. The transition from a hall full of noise, light and activity to one holding nothing but sleeping bodies and glowing embers rarely happens all at once. It unfolds gradually, one voice quieting after another, one candle carried away after the next, until the room that felt, only recently, like the busiest place in the entire castle, has become its quietest, holding within its stone walls an entire household drawing slow, even breaths in the dark. By full night, the hall has completed its transformation entirely, and anyone stepping quietly through the doorway with a single small candle for light would see rows of sleeping shapes across the floor, the dim red glow of banked embers at the room's centre, and very little else. The grand, echoing space of the daytime hall reduced for these few hours to something far simpler and far more essential: shelter and warmth and rest shared by everyone the castle holds within its walls. Not every household member sleeps in exactly the same spot every single night, and small negotiations over position, a slightly warmer corner traded for a favor owed, a spot nearer the door given up to someone recovering from illness, form their own quiet undercurrent to the hall's nightly transformation, unremarked upon by anyone yet perfectly understood by everyone involved. Furniture beyond the trestle tables receives its own nightly consideration as the hall converts itself for sleep. Benches are stacked or pushed against the walls alongside the tables, and any smaller stools or chairs belonging to more important household members are gathered carefully rather than left scattered where a half-asleep servant might stumble over them, crossing the darkened hall during the night. The very last person still moving through the hall before full quiet settles, often the steward or whoever holds equivalent responsibility that particular night, makes a final careful circuit, checking that the fire has been properly banked, that no candle has been left carelessly burning, that the great doors are barred securely against the night. Only once this circuit is complete and satisfactory does that last waking figure finally settle onto their own pallet, the hall now entirely given over to sleep. A household's youngest children, too small yet for any assigned sleeping spot of their own, are usually tucked in close beside a parent, regardless of where in the hall that parent happens to settle, small enough still to be carried easily from the day's activity straight into sleep without ever fully waking to notice the transition happening around them. A visiting guest of sufficient importance is usually spared the hall's communal floor entirely, offered instead whatever private chamber the household can spare for the duration of their stay, a courtesy extended as much for the household's own reputation as for the guest's comfort, since word of poor hospitality travels between noble households nearly as quickly and as thoroughly as any other piece of gossip. The particular sound of many people settling to sleep at once, shifting straw, a cleared throat, a quiet exchange of last words between neighbors on the floor, gradually thinning to nothing, is one that a household absorbs so completely over years that its absence, on the rare night the hall stands nearly empty, feels almost eerie by comparison. The familiar chorus of settling bodies simply missing from a room built and furnished specifically to hold it. There is a particular moment, easy to miss unless you are watching for it, when the hall stops being a room full of individual people and becomes instead a single sleeping shape breathing slowly together in the dark. It happens gradually, the way a fire dies down gradually rather than being extinguished all at once, one voice falling silent, then another, until whatever conversation was still murmuring somewhere near the embers finally trails off into nothing, and the room settles fully into the collective stillness it will hold until the first grey light finds its way back through the shutters. In the deepest hours of the night, the castle reaches a stillness that feels, to anyone awake to notice it, almost complete, though it is never quite total. Somewhere on the wall walk, a watchman continues his slow circuit. Boots against stone, the only sound marking his passage, his occasional call into the darkness, the sole voice still speaking within the entire complex of walls and towers. The embers in the great hall's banked fire hold their glow through these hours without ever quite catching back into open flame, a low, steady red light that illuminates almost nothing beyond the very stones nearest the hearth, yet somehow makes the darkness of the rest of the hall feel less absolute than it would in complete blackness. Anyone waking briefly in the night finds their eyes drawn to that small, persistent glow before anything else. Stone continues its own quiet conversation with the cold outside, contracting almost imperceptibly as the temperature drops further toward its lowest point before dawn, producing, every so often, a faint creak or settling sound that travels through the building's thick walls in a way that might startle a light sleeper unfamiliar with the castle's particular nighttime voice, though anyone who has slept here for more than a few nights learns to recognize it as entirely ordinary. Outside, if the sky is clear, more stars are visible above the castle than most later centuries of brighter, busier nights would ever allow, an entire, unbroken sweep of them stretching from one edge of the battlements to the other, utterly indifferent to whatever politics, celebrations, or quiet griefs are unfolding within the walls below them. Somewhere in the stable block, a horse shifts its weight and sighs, a low, huffing breath that carries faintly across the yard on a still night. In the kitchen, the last of the day's fires have finally burned down to nothing, leaving that usually busy room in a darkness and silence that feels almost unfamiliar after the constant activity it holds throughout the daylight hours. The private chambers above the hall hold their own quiet, bed curtains drawn fully closed around their sleeping occupants, the faint sound of breathing the only evidence to anyone who might pass silently by that the room is occupied at all. Whatever concerns or plans occupied the Lord's waking hours have, for these few hours at least, been set entirely aside, no different in this single respect from the servant sleeping on a straw pallet in the hall below. This is the hour when the castle belongs most completely to itself, less a stage for the daily business of governing, feeding, and defending a household, and more simply a shelter, doing the one thing shelters are built to do, holding back the cold and the dark from everyone gathered safely within its walls. The watchman's call comes again, distant and brief, marking another hour passed without incident, a small ritual repeated so many times across so many nights that it has become less a warning and more a kind of lullaby, a reminder, however faint, that someone remains awake and watching so that everyone else does not need to be. Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever fresh smoke fills the hall or fresh mud tracks across the bailey, whatever new gossip arrives with the next merchant through the gate, none of it has arrived yet. For now, there is only the castle, breathing slowly through its stone walls, holding its household close through the last dark hours before the first grey light finds its way, quietly, back over the battlements. A castle at this deepest hour holds within its sleeping walls an entire cross-section of a whole small society at once, the same roof sheltering lord and servant, guest and guard, in a closeness that the daylight hours, with all their visible distinctions of rank and duty, rarely make quite so plain. Somewhere in these deepest hours, if the season allows it, an owl calls from beyond the walls, a sound that carries easily across the quiet bailey and occasionally into the hall itself through whatever small gaps the shutters do not fully seal. It is a sound so ordinary to anyone raised here that it barely registers as anything worth noting, filed away alongside the watchman's call and the settling creak of cooling stone as simply one more thread in the familiar, well-worn fabric of an ordinary night. The household's dogs, usually so alert to any daytime disturbance, rest through these hours in a stillness nearly as complete as their sleeping owners, rousing only for a genuine disturbance rather than the ordinary small sounds a castle produces at night on its own. Their trust in the quiet, more than almost anything else, tells you how safe and how settled this particular night truly is. A single window left unshuttered by accident somewhere high in the keep sometimes lets a thin blade of moonlight fall across an otherwise entirely dark room, a small, almost accidental beauty that nobody deliberately arranged and that only the rare wakeful soul shifting on a pallet or lying awake in a curtained bed ever actually notices before it moves on and the room returns to full darkness again. A castle's very stillness at this hour carries its own kind of evidence, proof, if anyone needed it, that the walls have done their job for one more night, that the fire has been properly banked, the gates properly barred, the watch properly kept, all of it working together, quietly and without any fanfare, to hold an entire household safely through the dark. A truly deep winter night, cold enough that even the banked embers seem to offer less comfort than usual, sometimes finds a servant rising quietly to add one more careful log, not enough to properly rekindle the fire before morning, but enough to hold its heat a little longer through the coldest hours before dawn, a small, unremarked act of care performed for an entire sleeping household by whoever happens to wake first and notice the chill. If you have been listening long enough to reach this point, your own breathing has likely already slowed to match the pace of the story itself, each sentence arriving a little more softly than the one before it, each pause between them stretching a little longer, the way the gaps between the watchman's calls stretch longer as the night wears on and there is simply less need to reassure anyone who is, by now, already fast asleep. The castle you pictured at the very beginning of tonight's story, the still, silent, perfectly clean one, was never quite real. The real one was loud with dogs and bells and hammer strikes, smoky enough to sting the eyes, cold enough in its stone to hold winter in its walls until spring finally coaxed it back out again. It was less a dramatic ruin lit for a story and more a very large, very cold, very smoky family home filled with people simply trying, one banked fire and one strewn floor at a time, to stay warm through another night. If any of this tonight has made you curious about the rest of this library, all of these long, slow histories are also recorded in full as audiobooks on Spotify, the link always waiting quietly in the description or the pinned comment whenever you would rather listen than read. Thank you, gently and honestly, for spending this time here tonight. If a story like this one is useful to you, leaving it a like and subscribing helps this small collection of slow histories keep finding its way to people who need exactly this kind of quiet before sleep. There will be another story waiting whenever you come back for it. For now, though, let the castle rest. The embers in the great hall are low and red and asking nothing more of anyone. The stone has gone cold and still and silent around its sleeping household. Somewhere above the battlements, the same stars that watched this castle 700 years ago are watching it now. Patient, unhurried, in no rush at all for the night to end. Let your own breathing slow to match that quiet. Let your own body settle the way the hall itself settled. One small sound after another, falling away until only stillness remains. The fire is banked. The gates are closed. Nothing more needs to happen tonight. You can simply rest here, inside the warm dark, for as long as you need to. Sleep, when it finally comes tonight, will ask nothing more of you than the hall itself asked of everyone who ever slept within it, only that you lie still, and let the warmth hold you, and let the quiet do the rest. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that, and if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments.